The sunlight at Amarna does not fall gently. It arrives like a command. It pours over the eastern cliffs, strikes the pale limestone, floods the open courts of the temples, and turns the desert city into a place that seems almost too bright to belong to ordinary Egypt. Here, beside a bend of the Nile where the cultivated fields give way to empty rock and sand, a royal family steps into view again and again on carved walls Akhenaten. Thin-faced and strange in the new artistic language of his reign, Nefertiti, elegant, powerful, and impossible to ignore, and between them, beneath the rays of the Aten, their daughters. Among those daughters, one appears first, often closest, often most visible. Her name is Meritaten, beloved of Aten, and the surviving record places her at the heart of one of the most dramatic experiments in ancient history. She is not lost because no one ever wrote her name. Her name survives, her image survives. She appears in tomb scenes, royal reliefs, palace fragments, and the strange visual world of Akhenaten, the city modern people call Amarna. She is lost in a more troubling way. She stands in the light, yet her life dissolves just when Egypt needs clarity most. She belongs to a family that tries to reorder heaven, kingship, art, ritual, and memory itself, and then almost vanishes under the weight of its own revolution. What survives in the record suggests that Meritaten was more than a decorative princess in a royal household. She was a daughter of the king and queen, a public figure in religious imagery, and eventually a woman whose title and position may have carried real political meaning. But the evidence remains incomplete, and in the spaces between the carved names, scholars still debate how much power she held, whom she married, when she disappeared, and whether she briefly stood closer to the throne than most daughters of Egypt ever did. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Because Meritaten's story is not a simple biography. It is a slow walk through a ruined city where sunlight was theology, where family was propaganda, where affection and authority were carved into stone with equal care, and where a young royal woman became one of the most haunting traces left behind by Akhenaten's age. To enter her world, it helps to imagine Amarna not as a museum label, not as a flat archaeological site under a modern sun, but as a living capital. The Nile moves nearby, green and patient, carrying boats heavy with grain, stone, wood, and official messages. Beyond the fields, the desert rises quickly, bare and severe. The cliffs to the east form a natural wall, and in their curve Akhenaten sees something sacred a horizon, an opening, a stage for the daily rebirth of the sun. He names the place Akhenaten, the horizon of the Aten. In the early years of the city, everything is new. Temples stand open to the sky instead of hidden in dark sanctuaries. Courtyards are filled with offering tables. Palaces are painted with marsh scenes, birds, flowers, and patterned floors that make the royal residence feel less like a fortress and more like a ceremonial dream. Roads cut across the desert plain. Officials build tombs in the surrounding cliffs, and on their walls they record a court unlike any Egypt has seen before. In those scenes, the royal family becomes the central image of divine order. The Aten, shown not as a human-shaped god but as a shining disk, extends long rays downward, and at the end of many rays are tiny hands. Some hands hold ankhs, the sign of life, toward the nostrils of the king and queen. The effect is intimate and overwhelming. Life comes from above, through light itself, and the king's family stands beneath it as the chosen receiver. Meritaten, still young in many depictions, is not pushed to the edge. She is drawn within the circle of meaning, She may stand beside her mother, ride in a chariot, appear during ceremonies, or take part in scenes that show the royal household as the living bridge between earth and Aten. For an ancient Egyptian princess, visibility itself could be a form of power. It did not always mean personal freedom. It did not always mean authority in the modern sense, but it meant that her body, name, and presence mattered in the public language of the court. This is one of the first surprises about Meritaten. Many royal children in ancient Egypt pass through history like shadows, known only from a few names or a fragmentary inscription. Meritaten is different. She appears repeatedly because Amarna art makes the royal daughters unusually prominent. Akhenaten and Nefertiti are not shown as distant figures alone in ritual isolation. They are often shown with their daughters near them, touching them, holding them, bringing them into scenes of ceremony and devotion. Modern viewers sometimes read these images as private family snapshots, as though the walls of Amarna preserve a rare glimpse of domestic tenderness. There may be some truth in that impression, or at least some deliberate use of it. But nothing in royal Egyptian art is simple. These are not casual scenes. They are official images. They create an idea of the royal family as sacred, fertile, radiant, and uniquely close to the Aten. Meritaten's childhood, at least the part visible to us, is already ceremonial. The calm beauty of those images can make the age seem gentler than it was. Amarna was a place of sunlight, but also a place of pressure. Akhenaten's religious transformation did not merely add a new god to Egypt's crowded divine world. It elevated the Aten in ways that displaced older cults, especially the great power of Amun at Thebes. Temples, priesthoods, economic networks, artistic conventions, and sacred traditions all felt the force of this change. Meritaten grows up inside that break. Her earliest public identity is tied to the Aten so completely that even her name carries the god within it. She is beloved of Aten, not merely beloved by a father or a mother, not merely a princess of Egypt, but a child whose identity has been shaped by the religious revolution itself. And yet, behind all the brilliance, a simple human fact remains. Meritaten was born into a family that placed her before the eyes of the kingdom while she was still very young. She did not choose the new capital. She did not choose the new theology. She did not choose to become one of the living symbols of an experiment that later generations would try to undo. The surviving evidence does not allow us to recover her voice, her private thoughts, or the emotional texture of her days. No diary waits in the sand. No personal letter lets her speak across the centuries. What remains are names, titles, carved bodies, traces of royal ceremonies, and the ruined architecture of a city built to make the sun visible as truth. That is why Meritaten's story begins with light, but immediately moves towards shadow. The images show her close to power, close to Nefertiti, close to Akhenaten, close to the Aten's descending rays. But the closer she stands to the center of Amarna, the more deeply she's entangled in its mystery. She's both present and unreachable. She's carved again and again, yet her ending is uncertain. She belongs to the most famous royal family of the late 18th dynasty, yet she slips from the record in a way that feels almost deliberate. Later Egypt would restore older gods, alter names, dismantle buildings, reuse stones, and treat Akhenaten's age as something dangerous, embarrassing, or impure. In that long act of forgetting, Meritaten became one of the figures left half seen, not erased completely, but never fully restored. So the first image to hold is not a tomb, not a mummy, not a crown, not even a throne. It is a young royal woman beneath rays of carved sunlight, standing in a city that did not exist before her father's dream and would not survive long after his death. Around her, the court performs certainty, the Aten shines, the king offers, the queen appears magnificent, the daughters complete the sacred family. Everything is arranged to say that a new order has arrived and that it will endure. But from the distance of more than 3,000 years, the scene feels fragile. The stone has broken, the paint has faded, the city is mostly gone, and Meritaten, once placed in the brightest light Egypt could imagine, waits at the edge of history as the lost daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. The city around Meritaten begins not as a slow growth of houses and shrines, but as a royal decision pressed into the desert. Most Egyptian capitals carry the weight of long habit. Memphis has ancient prestige near the entrance to the delta. Thebes has the temples of Amun, processional roads, sacred festivals, priesthoods, and a memory that seems to run deep into the bedrock of the new kingdom. Akhenaten is different. It is not an inherited place. It is chosen, named, marked, and built with astonishing speed. In the imagination of Akhenaten's court, that newness is part of its purity. The city rises where no older god has a long-established claim, where no great temple estate can easily challenge the king's vision, and where the cliffs themselves form a vast eastern horizon for the Aten's daily appearance. Meritaten's childhood unfolds inside this act of creation, in a capital that is not simply a residence, but a statement in mud brick, limestone, sunlight, and obedience. Along the cliffs that frame the site, Akhenaten orders boundary inscriptions to be carved into the rock. They announce the limits of the Aten's new city and present the king's decision as sacred, final, and divinely inspired. These boundary stelae are among the most revealing documents of Amarna, not because they answer every question, but because they show how deliberately the place is imagined. The city is not meant to blend into older Egypt. It is set apart. It has borders. It has a theological purpose. It has a landscape chosen for the way sunlight strikes it, and for the way the desert seems to open like a stage. In those inscriptions, the royal family is part of the foundation. Akhenaten and Nefertiti are not merely rulers who happen to live there. Their bodies, rituals, and appearances help consecrate the city. Meritaten, as their eldest daughter, grows up within a space where even geography has been turned into royal theology. The building itself must have been a spectacle. Work gangs, officials, scribes, craftsmen, stonecutters, painters, boatmen, and supply managers converge on a stretch of land that had not been prepared by centuries of urban tradition. The first structures are practical as much as sacred. Palaces need walls, storehouses need roofs, roads need to be levelled. Wells and food supply system must serve a growing population. Temples need broad courts open to the sun. Workshops need space for sculptors, jewellers, plasterers, and painters. Administrative offices must keep account of grain, labour, livestock, offerings, and shipments arriving by river. Akhenaten may look, in surviving art, like a golden vision of divine light, but on the ground it also means dust, noise, heat, logistics, and relentless human effort. The evidence remains incomplete, yet the archaeology of Amarna makes one thing clear: this was a functioning city, not a symbolic backdrop. A lesser-known detail of this construction is the use of small standardized stone blocks often called talatat. These blocks could be quarried, moved, and assembled more quickly than massive traditional stones, allowing temples and decorated structures to rise with unusual speed. Later, when Akhenaten's memory became dangerous, many of these blocks were dismantled and reused elsewhere, sometimes hidden inside later constructions. Because of that reuse, modern scholars have been able to recover scattered fragments of Amarna's visual world far from their original setting: a hand, a sun ray, a princess's head, an offering table, a carved name, pieces of a city broken apart and redistributed through Egypt's later architecture. In Meritaten's world, these stones helped create the impression of sudden sacred permanence. In the world after her, they became debris of a rejected age. At the center of Akhenaten lies the ceremonial heart of the new regime. There are great open temples to the Aten, where the sun itself is not hidden behind temple walls, but invited into the ritual space. This is one of the most striking differences from much older Egyptian temple practice. In many traditional sanctuaries, divine presence is enclosed, approached through darker halls, accessible only through carefully controlled priestly ritual. In Amarna, the Aten's light needs no dark chamber. It falls directly onto offering tables and courtyards. Hundreds of altars may have filled these spaces, receiving bread, beer, meat, flowers, incense, and other offerings. The scale is impressive, but also revealing. Akhenaten's religion still requires enormous material support. A god of sunlight may seem abstract, but worship remains physical. It requires food, labor, storage, transport, and display. Meritaten's earliest public life takes shape against this constant rhythm of offering beneath an open sky. The royal road runs through the city like a ceremonial artery. Along it, the king and queen can appear in chariots, visible to officials and perhaps to selected crowds. The palaces are connected to administrative and sacred zones, turning movement itself into performance. A royal journey from palace to temple is not merely travel, it is a ritual statement. When Meritaten appears in Amarna imagery near her parents, she's not simply accompanying them as a child might accompany a family in private. She is participating in the stage visibility of the dynasty. The daughters help complete the image of fertility, divine favor, and sacred continuity. What survives in the record suggests that the royal children were used in this public language more strongly at Amarna than in many other periods. Their presence softened the image of the king while strengthening the idea that the Atene's blessing flowed directly into the royal household. Still, the city's brightness should not be mistaken for openness in the modern sense. Akhenaten is controlled by hierarchy. Its grand houses belong to officials who owe their rank to the king. Its tombs in the cliffs praise royal favor. Its art repeats the central truth of the regime life comes through Aten, and access to Aten is mediated by Akhenaten and his family. For Meritaten, this means a childhood surrounded by privilege and constraint. She likely inhabits palaces with painted walls, shaded rooms, gardens, servants, nurses, attendants, textiles, jewelry, and ritual objects. She may look out from balconies where the royal family appears above courtyards. She may travel in processions that show her to the city. But her world is not a private childhood as modern people might imagine it. Her identity is public from the beginning, tied to titles, images, and expectations that no child could fully understand at first. Beyond the palaces, the lives of ordinary residents reveal another side of the city. Archaeology at Amarna has uncovered houses, work areas, storage spaces, and cemeteries that remind us how many people carried the burden of the royal dream. Officials may have enjoyed decorated villas and access to court rewards, while labourers and servants lived in more modest conditions. The city's rapid construction likely created strain, and the skeletal evidence from non-royal cemeteries has often been discussed for what it may reveal about health, workload, and diet among the population. Scholars still debate the full meaning of this evidence, and no single explanation fully accounts for every pattern, but it complicates the shining official image. Akhenaten is both sacred horizon and hard-built settlement. It is both royal vision and human cost. For Meritaten, the new capital becomes the only world that matters in the surviving record. She is remembered not as a princess of Thebes, not as a daughter raised among the long halls of Karnak, but as a child of Akhenaten. Her name belongs to the Aten. Her image belongs to Amarna. Her family's most famous scenes belong to the city's carved and painted surfaces. This matters because Akhenaten is designed to make alternatives feel distant. The older gods are not completely absent from the minds of Egyptians, and across the wider country traditions continue in ways that are difficult to measure. But at the centre of the court, the new city narrows the world. The sun rises over the cliffs. The Aten's rays descend. The king speaks the theology. The queen stands beside him. The daughters appear as living proof that the new order has a future. Yet cities built as declarations can be fragile. Akhenaten rises quickly because one king commands it, and that is also its weakness. Its temples, palaces, roads, and workshops depend on a political and religious experiment tied intensely to Akhenaten's person. Meritaten grows up surrounded by architecture that seems permanent but is, in historical terms, almost temporary. The painted floors are still fresh. The plaster still holds colour. The cliffs still carry newly carved claims. Officials still decorate tombs with confident scenes of royal reward. But beneath the confidence is a question that no one at court can safely ask too loudly. What happens to a city built for one vision when that vision no longer controls Egypt? Meritaten's childhood is therefore not only the story of a princess in a new capital. It is the story of a young royal woman formed inside a place that tries to begin history again, while older Egypt waits beyond the horizon. Meritaten is born into a revolution before she can understand that it is dangerous. To the court around her, the change is wrapped in ceremony, gold, polished stone, and the language of divine truth. To later history, it looks more unstable. Akhenaten's reign is not simply remembered because he favoured a sun god. Egypt had long worshipped solar deities, and the sun had always carried immense sacred power. Ra, Harakti, Atum, and other solar forms were already woven into royal theology centuries before Meritaten's father appeared. What makes Akhenaten's experiment so startling is the intensity of his focus. The way the Aten becomes the supreme centre of public religion, and the way older divine images, names, priesthoods, and temple systems are pushed aside or diminished. Meritaten grows up not in a period of ordinary religious devotion, but in a court that tries to reorder the relationship between heaven, king, and country. The shift does not happen in a vacuum. Before Akhenaten, Egypt is already wealthy, expansive, and deeply tied to temple power. The 18th dynasty has produced warriors, builders, diplomats, and rulers whose names carry enormous weight. The god Amun, especially at Thebes, has risen to extraordinary prominence. His priesthood controls wealth, land, ritual authority, and sacred prestige. Kings honour Amun because Amun's favour helps legitimate kingship, and the temples of Amun flourish because royal patronage feeds them. This relationship can appear harmonious, but it also creates a powerful religious institution that stands close to the throne and sometimes uncomfortably near it. When Akhenaten elevates the Aten and eventually moves to Akhetaten, he is not only changing religious style, he is shifting the balance of power. For Meritaten, this means that her family's faith is also her family's politics. The Aten is not merely a god of warmth and light. In the official ideology of Amarna, the Aten is the source of life, and Akhenaten is the one who truly understands and serves that source. The king's role becomes unusually concentrated. Instead of a broad pantheon where many gods receive ritual attention through many temples and priests across Egypt, Amarna theology places extraordinary emphasis on the royal household as the privileged channel of divine life. The Aten gives life to the king and queen. The king and queen present offerings. The world receives order through them. Meritaten's public presence among her parents and sisters helps create the image of a sacred family enclosed in sunlight, almost like a living temple. What survives in the record suggests that this was not accidental decoration. It was a visual argument about where divine favour now resides. The older religious world, however, cannot simply be erased from Egyptian minds because a king commands it. For generations, people have prayed to household gods, honoured local deities, joined festivals, buried their dead with beliefs rooted in Osiris and the afterlife, and understood divine power as multiple, layered, and present in many forms. The evidence remains incomplete, especially for how ordinary people privately responded to Akhenaten's reforms. But it's unlikely that every Egyptian heart immediately followed the new official vision. Some complied because power required compliance. Some may have embraced the Aten sincerely. Some may have continued older habits quietly, especially away from the court. In this uncertainty, Meritaten's world becomes both brilliant and brittle. The court speaks in the language of absolute truth, but Egypt beyond the palace may be more complicated. The Amarna revolution changes art as well as worship. Akhenaten's body is shown in ways that still provoke debate: elongated face, narrow shoulders, swelling belly, wide hips, delicate limbs, and an almost fluid outline. Nefertiti too appears in a new visual style, elegant yet stylized, often with an elongated head and graceful neck. The daughters, including Meritaten, are frequently shown with lengthened skulls, slender bodies, and gestures that feel intimate or lively compared with older formal royal imagery. Scholars still debate how much of this reflects physical reality, religious symbolism, artistic experiment, or a deliberate court style designed to mark the new age as visually different from what came before. No single explanation fully accounts for every feature, but the effect is unmistakable. Meritaten is not merely living through a religious transformation. She's being represented in a transformed human form. This matters because royal art in Egypt does not operate like portraiture in the modern sense. It can preserve hints of individuality, but it also constructs ideal meanings. A princess's body in a relief is a political and religious text. Her pose, scale, placement, title, and relationship to her parents all communicate order. In Amarna art, the daughters often appear active, leaning, touching, turning, or standing near their mother and father. The result can feel unusually warm, almost domestic, especially when Akhenaten and Nefertiti are shown with children on their laps or nearby beneath the Aten. Yet these images are also disciplined. They teach viewers that the royal household is the center of sacred life. Meritaten's childhood image becomes a tool of the state, even while it may preserve echoes of real closeness within the family. There is a quiet paradox here. Akhenaten's revolution seems to simplify religion by directing devotion toward the Aten, but it also makes access to divine meaning more exclusive. The Aten is visible to everyone in one sense, because the sun shines on all. Yet official worship centers on the king's unique relationship with the god. The people may receive life from Aten, but the king interprets Aten. The court celebrates Aten through royal ritual. The daughters stand near that ritual as privileged beings. Meritaten's identity is therefore elevated and confined at once. She is more visible than many royal daughters before her, but that visibility depends on a system that uses her as proof of its own sacred truth. The danger grows sharper when Akhenaten's reforms turn against the names and images of older gods. The removal or suppression of Amun's name from inscriptions is one of the clearest signs that this is not merely a devotional preference. To alter a god's name in Egypt is not a small act. Names have power. Images have presence. To erase them is to attack the continuity of sacred life. Later generations would remember Akhenaten's period with discomfort, and the king himself would be excluded from some king lists, treated almost as an interruption. In that later hostility, the entire royal family becomes vulnerable. Meritaten is not responsible for the revolution, but she is born inside its symbolic machinery. Her name, her titles, and her images tie her to a religious order that future rulers will work to dismantle. And yet, inside the court, the mood may not have felt like collapse. It may have felt like certainty. The king has founded a city. The queen appears beside him with exceptional prominence. The princesses are healthy enough to be displayed in ceremonial imagery. Officials receive rewards from palace windows, temples fill with offerings, artists create new forms, scribes record new names and hymns, foreign envoys still come, the machinery of state still moves, for those close to power. Amarna may have seemed not like a dangerous experiment, but like the beginning of an eternal correction. Meritaten's early life would have been surrounded by that confidence, by people who had every reason to perform belief even if private doubts existed. A lesser-known aspect of the Amarna age is how deeply its revolution depends on repetition. The Aten's rays, the offering tables, the royal family, the open courts, the boundary stelae, the reward scenes, the elongated forms, the names in cartouches all repeat a message until the city itself becomes a kind of visual chant. Meritaten appears within this repetition, and repetition is how power trains memory. But memory can be trained in the opposite direction too. After Amarna, Egypt will repeat a different message restoration, return, correction, the re-establishment of older gods, the rejection of the heretic king. The same culture that once carved Meritaten into sacred light will later allow her world to be broken apart, reused, buried, and forgotten. This is what makes her position so fragile. She is the beloved daughter of a revolution that needs daughters. She helps embody the hope that Akhenaten's new order is not a lonely obsession but a living dynasty. Through Meritaten and her sisters, the Aten's blessing appears fertile, continuous, familial. The revolution has a future because the royal household has children. But dynastic symbolism is not the same as dynastic security. A royal daughter can be visible without being safe from political change. She can be honoured in reliefs and still vanish from history. She can stand near the centre and still leave almost no personal record behind. So Meritaten's childhood under Akhenaten is not just the story of a princess growing up in an unusual palace. It is the story of a child made into a sign. Her name praises the Aten. Her image supports the new theology. Her family's affection, real or staged or both, becomes part of the state's sacred language. Around her, older gods lose space, older priesthoods lose favor, older artistic conventions bend into strange new forms. The city insists that the sun has revealed a purer truth, but the deeper one listens, the more one can hear the strain beneath the brightness. Meritaten belongs to the shining surface of Amarna, yet from the beginning, the shadow of its future erasure is already present. The revolution raises her into history, and the failure of that same revolution will nearly take her out of it. Nefertiti's presence at Amarna is so strong that it can make everyone around her appear smaller at first glance. She's not simply the beautiful queen of a later museum posters and modern imagination. In the surviving art of Akhenaten's reign, she's a public religious actor, a partner in ritual, a figure whose authority is displayed with unusual force. She stands beside the king beneath the Aten's rays, receives life from the sun disk, makes offerings, rides in ceremonial scenes, and in some images appears in positions that earlier Egyptian queens rarely occupied so openly. For Meritaten, this matters deeply. Her mother is not a quiet background figure in the royal household. Nefertiti is one of the central pillars of the Amarna world, and the eldest daughter grows up in the long shadow of a queen who has been made almost inseparable from the sacred image of the regime. The name Nefertiti means something close to the beautiful one has come, and later history has leaned heavily on that beauty. But beauty alone is too small a frame for her. At Amarna, Nefertiti's image becomes political theology. She's shown with a prominence that suggests more than ornamental queenship. In some scenes, she mirrors the king's ritual actions. In others, she appears with the daughters as the fertile centre of the royal family. There are even images where she smites enemies, a type of scene traditionally associated with kingship and royal domination. Scholars still debate exactly how far her authority extended in practice, and the evidence remains incomplete. But the visual record insists that she was more than a passive consort. She was part of how Akhenaten's revolution explained itself. Meritaten's earliest public identity is therefore shaped not only by her father's theology, but by her mother's performance of power. In the carved scenes, the daughters often gather around Nefertiti as much as around Akhenaten. They touch her, stand near her, accompany her, and help create the image of a royal household blessed by the Aten. Meritaten, as the eldest, frequently appears in a position of particular importance. She is the first daughter, the one whose visibility may have carried the strongest message of continuity. If Nefertiti represents royal womanhood transformed into sacred partnership, Meritaten represents the next generation of that transformation. She's not yet queen in the early scenes, but she is learning, through image and ceremony, what a royal woman can become in this strange new world. This relationship must be handled carefully, because the record gives us images, not private conversations. We do not know whether Meritaten admired Nefertiti, feared the expectations placed upon her, or understood herself as being trained for a future role. We do not know the emotional language of their relationship. Ancient Egyptian royal art is not a window left open by accident. It is a decorated wall built to communicate approved meanings. Yet what survives in the record suggests a court in which royal daughters were displayed with unusual care, and where the eldest daughter's closeness to the queen was not meaningless. Even if the images are formal, they preserve a pattern. Meritaten is repeatedly placed within the female side of Amarna authority, near the woman whose public status was extraordinary. One of the most striking features of Nefertiti's Amarna role is that she appears almost as a counterpart to Akhenaten in the family's sacred structure. The king remains central, of course. Egypt is still ruled through kingship, and Akhenaten's relationship with the Aten is the core of official doctrine. But Nefertiti's presence helps solve a problem within that doctrine. If the Aten is life-giving and universal, and if the royal household is the privileged channel through which that life is displayed, then the queen and daughters become essential signs of fertility, renewal, and cosmic balance. Nefertiti is not just the king's wife. She is the mother of the visible sacred family. Meritaten is not just a daughter. She is part of the proof that the Aten's favour produces life and continuity. The Amarna family scenes can feel startlingly intimate because they show gestures rarely emphasized in earlier royal art. A child reaches toward a parent. A daughter sits on a lap. The king and queen appear with their children in a way that almost seems domestic. Meritaten and her sisters are not stiff symbols alone. They lean, move, and inhabit space with a strange liveliness. But this intimacy is also a kind of statecraft. The royal family is made approachable without becoming ordinary. The tenderness, whether based on real affection or carefully staged symbolism, supports the central message this family is uniquely alive under the Aten. Nefertiti's motherhood and Meritaten's daughterhood are not private conditions hidden behind palace walls. They are public instruments of the new order. There is a lesser-known tension in this visibility. The more prominent Nefertiti becomes, the more difficult it is to decide where queenship ends and something closer to kingship begins. Some scholars have considered whether Nefertiti may have held elevated status late in Akhenaten's reign, perhaps even under another royal name. Others remain cautious, pointing out that the evidence is fragmentary, damaged, and often open to more than one reading. No single explanation fully accounts for every inscription, image, and disappearance, but the uncertainty itself tells us something about the Amarna court. Female royal power there was visible enough, flexible enough, and unusual enough that later historians still struggle to draw clean boundaries around it. Meritaten, growing within that world, inherits not only her mother's prestige but also her ambiguity. This ambiguity may have shaped Meritaten's later path. In a more conventional court, the eldest daughter of a king and queen might still hold honour, but her role could remain limited unless dynastic circumstances demanded more. At Amarna, the rules feel less settled. The religious revolution has already broken older patterns. The queen has already been elevated visually. The daughters have already become part of public ritual language. If succession becomes uncertain, if male heirs are young, weak, absent, or politically complicated, the eldest royal daughter may suddenly matter far more than expected. Meritaten's later titles and possible marriage to Smenkhkare belong to a future section of the story, but the foundations are laid here, in the shadow of Nefertiti's example. The daughter sees, or at least is made to embody, a model of a royal womanhood that stands closer to power than most. Nefertiti's shadow is not merely personal, it is artistic, ceremonial, and political. Her famous blue crown, her long neck, her refined profile, and her serene but distant expression have become modern icons. Yet at Amarna these forms were not museum beauty. They were part of royal messaging. The queen's body was shaped by the same artistic revolution that reshaped Akhenaten and the daughters. Meritaten's own elongated features in reliefs connect her visually to both parents and to the new sacred style. In that sense, she inherits not only bloodline but form. Her very appearance on the walls makes her part of the Amarna aesthetic, the visual language that marks this family as unlike all others. And yet, the shadow of such a mother can be dangerous after the light changes. When Nefertiti is powerful, Meritaten's closeness to her strengthens the daughter's status. If Nefertiti disappears from the record, that closeness becomes part of a puzzle. Did Meritaten step into some of the roles her mother once performed? Did she replace Nefertiti in certain ceremonial or dynastic functions? Did she become important because the queen was gone, transformed, renamed, or politically repositioned? Scholars still debate these possibilities, and the surviving evidence does not allow certainty. But the question is unavoidable because Meritaten does not remain only a child in the imagery. As the Amarna years unfold, her titles and presence begin to change. The daughter who once stood beneath her mother's protection starts to appear as a royal woman in her own right. For now, the strongest image is still that of inheritance. Meritaten grows up in a court where her mother makes royal womanhood visible at a scale Egypt rarely shows. Nefertiti demonstrates that a queen can stand in sunlight beside the king, can receive the Aten's life, can perform ritual, can embody fertility, can project authority, and can become indispensable to a religious revolution. Meritaten's life is shaped by that example, whether as daughter, pupil, symbol, or possible successor in feminine power. She's not simply following Nefertiti through palace corridors. She's following her through a new grammar of queenship, one written in rays, offerings, crowns, and carefully carved gestures. This is why Meritaten cannot be understood apart from Nefertiti. Akhenaten gives the revolution its theology, but Nefertiti gives it a face of royal continuity and sacred womanhood. The daughters, especially Meritaten, extend that face into the future. In the official dream of Amarna, father, mother, and children stand together beneath the Aten, and the brightness around them claims to be eternal. But the dream depends on living people, and living people vanish. As Meritaten grows older, the queen beside her will become harder to trace, the court will become more uncertain, and the daughter in the mother's shadow will begin moving toward a darker, more complicated place in the record. The light that once joined them will soon begin separating them. Inside the Amarna court, life is arranged to make the royal family visible and the Aten unavoidable. The city's temples open toward the sky, but the palace world is more layered, more controlled, and more full of movement than the surviving ruins first suggest. Meritaten's days, as far as they can be reconstructed, would have unfolded between bright ceremonial spaces and shaded domestic interiors, between public appearances and the more protected rhythms of royal residence. The evidence remains incomplete, and no surviving document describes an ordinary morning in her own words. Still, the fragments of Amarna allow a careful glimpse into the world that shaped her painted floors beneath royal feet, balconies where rewards were distributed, gardens that brought marsh and river imagery into the desert, storerooms filled by the labour of the state, and temples where worship meant standing under the living heat of the sun. The royal palace at Amarna was not merely a private home. It was a machine of appearance. Its rooms, courts, bridges, and ceremonial windows helped stage the relationship between ruler, family, officials, and God. In some areas, the palace floors were painted with astonishing natural scenes pools, birds, plants, calves, and delicate marsh life. This is one of the most surprising details of Amarna's material world. In a capital built in a dry desert bay, the royal residence could create the illusion of stepping across a living wetland. The imagery may have evoked fertility, renewal, the Nile's abundance, and the king's power to gather all life under Aten's light. For Meritaten, such painted surfaces were not museum art. They were part of the sensory environment of power. She moved through spaces where even the floor carried symbolic meaning. The court around her would have been busy from early light, Servants, attendants, guards, scribes, messengers, priests, craftsmen, and officials all had roles to play in keeping the royal household functioning. Linen had to be prepared, jewellery and collars had to be stored, cleaned, and selected. Food had to arrive from kitchens and storehouses. Chariots needed care. Ceremonial objects had to be ready for appearances. Musicians and singers may have accompanied ritual occasions. Scribes recorded deliveries, titles, favours, and offerings. The palace was not silent luxury. It was controlled motion. The higher one stood in rank, the more invisible the labour beneath one's comfort could become. But it was always there, carrying the weight of the royal image. Meritaten's own appearance would have mattered. Royal women did not step into public scenes as unprepared individuals. Clothing, wigs or styled hair, jewellery, cosmetic detail, posture, and placement all helped create meaning. In Amarna art, the princesses sometimes appear with the distinctive side lock of youth, sometimes with close-fitting garments, sometimes adorned in ways that connect them to ritual and family display. As Meritaten grows older, her visual role changes. But even early on, her body is part of court ceremony. She does not merely live in the palace, she is one of the palace's messages. What survives in the record suggests that her visibility was carefully shaped, especially because she was the eldest daughter and therefore the first female child through whom Akhenaten and Nefertiti's sacred family could project continuity. Food and offerings form another layer of this world. The Aten's temples required enormous quantities of material goods, and the palace likely stood at the receiving end of an equally complex supply system. Bread, beer, vegetable, fruit, meat, fish, oils, wine, incense, and flowers all move through channels of production and distribution. In the formal temple scenes, offerings rise in almost overwhelming abundance. Tables overflow beneath the rays of the Aten, creating a visual theology of plenty. But that abundance had to come from somewhere. Fields along the Nile, estates, herds, workshops, and storehouses fed the spectacle. Meritaten's life at court was surrounded by this abundance, but also by the administrative world that made abundance visible and politically useful. The rhythm of worship at Amarna differed from the older hidden rituals of many Egyptian temples. Instead of a god enclosed in a dark sanctuary, the Aten was honoured in open courts filled with light. This made ritual visually powerful but also physically demanding. The sun that gave life also burned. Ceremonies under the Egyptian sky could mean glare, heat, dust, and long formal movement. Akhenaten's theology may have celebrated light as divine truth, but the human body still had to stand beneath it. Meritaten and the royal women, when present in public ritual imagery, appear serene and composed. The art does not show discomfort, it does not show fatigue. Royal art rarely does. Yet the lived experience of Amarna ceremony must have involved the body as much as belief, the feel of linen in heat, the weight of jewellery, the brightness of stone, the smell of offerings, the murmured work of attendants, the disciplined silence expected around the king. Within the palace, the boundary between family and state remained thin. Scenes of affection at Amarna have long fascinated modern viewers because they seem to show Akhenaten and Nefertiti with their daughters in unusually tender arrangements. Meritaten may be shown close to her parents, participating in moments that look almost private. But in the court, privacy was itself shaped by rank. A royal child could be cherished and still be ceremonial. A family gesture could be sincere and still be political. No single explanation fully accounts for the emotional tone of these images. They may preserve something real about how the royal household wished to be seen, or even how it experienced itself, but they were also designed to teach a doctrine of sacred family life. Meritaten grew inside that overlap, where affection and ideology were not easily separated. The people surrounding her were not only relatives and servants. The Amarna court included powerful officials whose careers depended on the king's favour. Men such as high-ranking administrators, military figures, priests of the Aten, sculptors, and overseers of works helped build and maintain the new order. Their tombs in the cliffs preserve scenes of reward, where the royal family appears at a window and grants gold or honours to loyal servants. These scenes reveal the court's economy of favour. To be near the king was to be near life, wealth, and legitimacy. Meritaten, appearing within this world, would have understood from an early age that closeness to the royal body was a form of power. She herself was born into that closeness. But even for her, status had to be displayed, repeated, and recognized. A lesser-known but revealing part of Amarna is the artists' and sculptors' world. The famous workshop associated with the sculptor Thutmose, where the bust of Nefertiti was found, points to a court culture deeply invested in image-making. Models, trial pieces, plaster faces, and sculptural studies suggest that Amarna's unusual style did not emerge casually. It was practiced, refined, and reproduced by skilled hands. Meritaten's face, like those of her parents and sisters, belonged to this world of artistic construction. Her image was not merely copied from life, it was shaped through the visual rules of the regime. This makes her both more present and more elusive. We see her often enough to recognize her importance, but not clearly enough to know what she truly looked like. Outside the palace's formal spaces, there may have been gardens, shaded courts, pools, and rooms where the royal women spent time away from public ceremony. The evidence does not let us map Meritaten's private movements with confidence, but royal residences in Egypt often blended pleasure, symbolism, and controlled seclusion. The desert city needed created coolness water, shade, painted vegetation, woven screens, and interior spaces that softened the force of the sun. In such places, Meritaten's life may have contained quiet hours of instruction, grooming, music, religious preparation, and family ritual, but even those quieter spaces belonged to a household watched by servants, structured by rank and tied to the demands of kingship. So the Amarna court was not a dream of sunlight alone. It was a living system of ritual, administration, art, supply, performance, and controlled intimacy. Meritaten's daily world held beauty, but not simplicity. Painted marshes lay underfoot in a desert capital. Offerings piled high beneath a god who was also the sun itself. Artists shaped royal faces into a new sacred language. Officials waited for favour. Servants made ceremony possible. Nefertiti's authority filled the court, and Akhenaten's theology pressed meaning into every appearance. Within all of it, Meritaten moved from childhood toward a more public female role, learning, whether by instruction or by constant exposure, that in Amarna a royal woman could never be merely herself. She was body, daughter, symbol, offering, future, and warning, all at once. As Meritaten grows older, the images around her begin to change in weight. She's no longer only the eldest daughter nestled within the sacred family beneath the Aten's rays. She becomes a royal woman whose titles and appearances suggest a more serious place in the machinery of succession, ceremony, and court politics. Ancient Egypt often defined women of the royal house through relationships: daughter of the king, wife of the king, mother of the king, sister of the king. These titles were not minor labels. They could open access to ritual prestige, property, visibility, and influence. In Meritaten's case, the movement from princess to powerful royal woman is one of the most important turns in her story, because it brings her closer to the throne at the very moment when the Amarna experiment begins to face its most uncertain future. Her name had already marked her as a child of the Aten, as the eldest known daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. Meritaten appears early and prominently in royal scenes, and this alone would have given her a special position among the princesses. Birth order mattered in dynastic imagination, even when succession did not always pass through simple lines. In a royal household where male heirs were either absent from early public imagery or not yet central, the daughters carried visible symbolic importance. Meritaten, standing first among them, could represent continuity before any prince steps clearly into the scene. What survives in the record suggests that she was not treated as interchangeable with her sisters. Her placement, titles, and later associations point to a woman whose role expanded as the reign progressed. One of the key titles attached to Meritaten is King's Daughter, a phrase that may sound simple but carried immense force in ancient Egypt. It tied her directly to Akhenaten's body and legitimacy. She was not merely noble, she was born from the living source of royal authority. In Amarna ideology, that authority had been bound tightly to the Aten, so Meritaten's daughterhood became both dynastic and religious. She belonged to the sacred household through which life from the Aten was displayed to Egypt. Later, more elevated titles complicate her position. In some evidence, Meritaten is associated with the status of Great Royal Wife, a title usually belonging to the principal queen. This is where her story becomes more difficult, because the evidence is fragmentary, and scholars still debate exactly how to interpret it. The name most often linked to her adult political role is Smenkhkare, one of the shadowiest figures of the Amarna period. Smenkhkare appears briefly near the end of Akhenaten's reign, or just after it, and Meritaten is widely thought to have been his great royal wife. If this reconstruction is correct, then Meritaten moved from being the king's eldest daughter to being the principal wife of a ruler who stood in the line of succession during a deeply unstable transition. That would have placed her at the heart of power, not at its margins. Yet uncertainty surrounds almost every part of this arrangement. Smenkkare's identity, relationship to Akhenaten, length of reign, and political role remain debated. Meritaten's connection to him is one of the strongest clues we have for her adult importance, but it does not solve the larger puzzle. It deepens it. Marriage within royal families in ancient Egypt was often shaped by dynastic logic rather than ordinary domestic expectation. Royal bloodlines were guarded, displayed, and sometimes deliberately concentrated. A princess who married a king or co-regent could strengthen that ruler's legitimacy by linking him visibly to the central royal line. If Smenkhkare was a son, brother, or close male relative of Akhenaten, Meritaten's marriage to him may have helped present a smooth continuation of Amarna rule. If he was less directly connected, her importance would have been even greater, because as Akhenaten and Nefertiti's eldest daughter, she carried powerful symbolic capital. In either case, she was not simply being placed into a private union, she was being used to bind uncertain kingship to the sacred family of Akhenaten. This is one of the striking realities of Meritaten's life. The court that once displayed her as a child of divine light may later have needed her as a political bridge. The young princess shown near her mother becomes a woman through whom legitimacy could pass, or at least be displayed. Such a role did not require her to rule independently in order to matter. In ancient monarchy, symbolism could be action. A title could stabilize a claim. A marriage could speak to officials, priests, foreign envoys, and the palace elite without a word of explanation. Meritaten's body and name, already shaped by years of public display, could be placed beside a new king or co-ruler to say that the line continued, that the Aten's favour had not been interrupted, that Amarna still had a future. A lesser-known complication is that Meritaten's name appears in contexts that show how royal women at Amarna could be repositioned in surprising ways. Some inscriptions and objects from the period have been altered, reused, or damaged, making it difficult to know whether a title belongs to her originally, whether it replaced another name, or whether later restoration changed the reading. The Amarna period is full of such problems. Names are erased, overwritten, restored, or reconstructed from broken traces. A princess becomes a queen in one piece of evidence, remains a daughter in another, and disappears entirely in a third. The result is not a clean career path but a set of flickering images. The evidence remains incomplete, and any responsible account must leave room for uncertainty. Still, the broad direction is clear enough to feel the pressure building around her. Meritaten's adulthood arrives at a time when the royal household is no longer simply celebrating itself. The later years of Akhenaten's reign are marked by losses, disappearances, and possible rearrangements of status among the royal women. Some of Meritaten's sisters become less visible or appear in mournful contexts. Nefertiti's role becomes harder to trace. Kia, another royal woman associated with Akhenaten, appears in evidence that has often been altered or replaced. Within this shifting environment, Meritaten seems to rise. Her prominence may not reflect only personal elevation, it may reflect need. The court may have been adjusting to deaths, political vacancies, or succession problems that the official art preferred not to explain plainly. Her possible role as great royal wife also changes the way we look back at her childhood images. The little princess beneath the Aten is not merely a charming detail. She may have been, from early on, the most important female child in a dynasty that would later struggle to preserve itself. Every appearance of her near Akhenaten and Nefertiti becomes a seed of later authority. The court teaches viewers to recognize her. It places her in the sacred family. It attaches her to the Aten. When she later appears in more elevated status, the visual groundwork has already been laid. Egypt has already seen her. The elite has already learned that Meritaten belongs close to the center. But closeness to the center is not the same as control. A royal woman could be powerful and still constrained by decisions made around her. Meritaten may have had ritual authority, ceremonial importance, household influence, and political value, but the record does not tell us how much agency she exercised. Did she shape events, or was she shaped by them? Did she understand herself as protecting her father's revolution, supporting Smenkkare's claim, preserving Nefertiti's legacy, or simply surviving the changing demands of the court? Scholars still debate the nature of female power at Amarna, because the evidence gives us visibility without interiority. We can see Meritaten's importance rising, but we cannot hear her intentions. The move from princess to royal woman also changes the emotional texture of her story. Childhood at Amarna, even when public and ceremonial, still belongs to the language of family. Adulthood belongs to the language of succession. Meritaten becomes part of the problem every dynasty must face: how power continues when a king weakens, dies, or leaves behind uncertainty. Akhenaten's revolution made that problem more acute because it had tied religion so intensely to one royal vision. A normal succession could be difficult enough. A succession after a theological upheaval was far more dangerous. Meritaten's importance grows because the future of Amarna needs bodies who can carry legitimacy forward. At this point in her life, the light around her becomes less innocent. The Aten's rays still descend in art. The royal titles still declare order. The palace still stages ceremony. But Meritaten's adult role suggests that beneath the official brightness, the court is preparing for transition. She is no longer only proof that Akhenaten and Nefertiti are blessed with daughters. She may now be part of the mechanism by which the regime tries to survive beyond them. That makes her more powerful. And also more exposed. The same visibility that raised her above the level of forgotten princesses binds her fate to a political world already beginning to tremble. So Meritaten becomes a royal woman in a city that still insists it is eternal, though history knows it is not. Her title may change. Her husband or political partner may be Smenkhkare. Her position may approach queenship. Yet the closer she moves toward the throne, the less certain the record becomes. It is as though the brightest centre of Amarna has burned away the very details modern people most want to see. We are left with a young woman stepping forward through damaged inscriptions, carrying the blood of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, the name of the Aten, and the burden of a revolution that's about to discover how fragile sacred certainty can be. Amarna art is one of the reasons Meritaten feels so close, and one of the reasons she remains so unreachable. The walls seem to show a family instead of a distant institution. A king bends toward his daughters, a queen holds a child, princesses lean forward, touch their parents, ride in chariots, follow ceremonies, and appear beneath the Aten's rays with a liveliness that can feel almost startling after the formal stiffness many people expect from ancient Egyptian royal art. Meritaten belongs to this visual revolution from the beginning. Her small figure, her elongated head, her delicate gestures, and her repeated closeness to Akhenaten and Nefertiti make her appear more human than many royal daughters of earlier reigns. Yet this same art that appears to reveal the family is also carefully designed to conceal the difference between living people and royal ideology. The first trap is to mistake intimacy for transparency. Amarna images may look personal, but they are still official art. They were carved in tombs, palaces, temples, and ceremonial spaces to communicate approved truths about the king, the Aten, and the royal household. When Akhenaten and Nefertiti are shown with their daughters, the viewer is not simply being invited into a private room. The viewer is being taught how to understand divine order. The Aten gives life. The king and queen receive and return it through offerings. The daughters show that the royal body is fertile, beloved, and continuous. Meritaten's presence strengthens the message because she is the eldest daughter, the first visible extension of that sacred family line. What seems at first like tenderness also functions as theology. This does not mean the images are false in any simple sense. They may preserve gestures drawn from real family life, or at least from a court culture that wanted affection to be visible. No single explanation fully accounts for the emotional force of Amarna art. It is possible that Akhenaten's court deliberately softened royal imagery, showing the king as husband and father to create a new kind of sacred immediacy. It is also possible that the style reflects deeper religious ideas about life, fertility, and the Aten's creative energy flowing through the royal family. The evidence remains incomplete, and modern viewers must resist both extremes, treating the art as a family album, or stripping it of all human feeling. Meritaten's images live between those poles. They're intimate and constructed, revealing and controlled. The physical style itself adds to the mystery. The Amarna royal family is represented with long faces, narrow chests, swelling forms, thin limbs, and skull shapes that have provoked generations of debate. Older explanations sometimes searched for medical conditions or inherited disorders, trying to read the art almost as diagnosis. More cautious interpretations emphasize style, symbolism, and religious meaning. Akhenaten's body may have been exaggerated to express uniqueness, fertility, or the king's unusual relationship to creation. The daughters' elongated heads and bodies may connect them visually to this sacred family language, rather than record exact anatomy. Scholars still debate the issue, but the safest conclusion is that Amarna art cannot be read as straightforward biological portraiture. Meritaten's carved form tells us how the court wanted her to be seen, not exactly what a person standing before her would have observed. The art also plays with scale and placement. In Egyptian visual language, size often reflects status, not physical measurement. The king and queen dominate scenes, while daughters appear smaller but still carefully positioned. Meritaten's place among her sisters matters. She is often shown first or closest, signalling rank within the group. When the daughters are named, their order can help reconstruct family hierarchy and changing status. Yet damaged scenes and incomplete inscriptions complicate the picture. Sometimes names are missing, sometimes a figure is broken away, sometimes later alterations disturb the original arrangement. A princess may be identifiable in one scene, uncertain in another. The viewer wants a stable face and biography, but the stone gives fragments. The tombs of Amarna officials preserve some of the richer scenes. These tombs do not glorify officials independently. They show officials receiving favour from the royal family and participating in the new order. The famous reward scenes, where the king and queen appear at a window to distribute gold collars and honours, are not merely records of court ceremony. They are images of dependence. Officials rise because Akhenaten sees them, rewards them, and places them within the Aten's light. The royal daughters may appear nearby, turning a political act into a family-centered sacred event. Meritaten's presence in such scenes helps bind the administration of Egypt to the image of the royal household. A reward from the palace is not just salary or promotion. It is participation in the world her family has created. There is a lesser-known strangeness in how Amarna art handles space. Traditional Egyptian art often presents figures in formal registers, carefully arranged and timeless. Amarna scenes sometimes feel more open, more crowded with movement, more willing to show bodies bending, reaching, or overlapping. Chariots race, horses strain, servants carry objects. The royal family appears in active ceremonial life. This does not make the scenes realistic in a modern sense, but it creates a sense of immediacy. Meritaten's world seems to move. The city does not feel frozen, it feels staged in motion. That motion may be one reason the Amarna period remains so compelling. Its art gives the illusion that if one could step a little closer, the royal family might keep moving beyond the broken edge of the wall. But art that moves can also mislead. Meritaten's repeated presence may make her seem better documented than she is. In truth, we have many images of her role and almost no direct evidence of her personal life. We see her in ceremonial positions, but not choosing them. We see her named, but not speaking. We see her growth into a royal woman, but not the decisions that shaped that growth. Even her later titles depend on fragments that scholars interpret through comparison, reconstruction, and careful caution. Amarna art surrounds her with life while withholding her inner reality. It gives her a body in stone and takes away her voice. The problem becomes sharper because Amarna itself was later broken apart. Many decorated stones were removed from their original locations, reused, buried, or found out of context. When archaeologists and Egyptologists reconstruct scenes from scattered fragments, they are often rebuilding a shattered visual sentence. A ray of the Aten may survive without the hand it once touched. A princess's name may survive without the body. A body may survive without the name. A queen's figure may be altered into another woman's, or a secondary royal woman's image may be replaced by a more favoured one. Meritaten's world was not only artistically unusual, it was materially disturbed. The art conceals partly because time and later politics have damaged the original message. This is especially important when considering identity. The Amarna royal women can be difficult to separate in fragmentary evidence. Meritaten, Meritaten, Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and other female figure appear in a court where names, titles, and images sometimes overlap or are changed. A crown, a title, or a position can suggest identity, but not always prove it. Some scenes have been reinterpreted multiple times as new evidence or new readings emerge. Scholars still debate whether certain images show Nefertiti, Meritaten, or another royal woman, especially in the turbulent late Amarna years. The result is a historical atmosphere filled with half-visible women, each powerful in different ways, each partly hidden behind damaged stone. And yet, without this art, Meritaten would be far more lost. The same visual system that distorts her also preserves her. It tells us she mattered. It shows that she was not a marginal child. It places her repeatedly within the sacred family and later near the adult structures of power. It reveals the values of the Amarna court sunlight, offering, family, fertility, movement, royal intimacy, and absolute dependence on the Aten through Meritaten's images. We see a daughter turned into proof that the revolution has a future. We see how a princess could be used to humanize a radical theology. We see how female presence could become central to a regime that still revolved around kingship. The art of Amarna therefore leaves Meritaten suspended between closeness and distance. She is near enough to feel almost present, a child beneath the rays, a young woman beside power, a name carved with care. But she is far enough that every detail must be handled gently. Her face is a style. Her gestures are formal. Her family scenes are sacred propaganda. Her titles are sometimes fragmentary. Her identity is visible but not fully recoverable. The more the art seems to open the palace doors, the more clearly one notices the screen still standing behind them. So Meritaten survives as one of the paradoxes of Amarna art. She is revealed because the court wanted her seen, and concealed because the court only wanted her seen in certain ways. The walls give her sunlight but not privacy, status but not speech, movement but not freedom from interpretation. They show a daughter inside a family that tried to remake Egypt's vision of the divine, and they leave modern observers staring into damaged brightness, trying to decide where the person ends and the symbol begins. In that uncertainty, Meritaten becomes more than a lost princess. She becomes a reminder that ancient art does not simply show the past. It negotiates with it, edits it, polishes it, and sometimes hides its deepest human truths in plain sight. Then Nefertiti begins to slip from the record, and the brightness of Amarna changes. It does not go dark all at once. There is no single scene where the queen walks out of history and the doors close behind her. Instead, her visibility becomes uneven, her titles and appearances harder to follow, her role more difficult to separate from the shifting names and damaged inscriptions of the late reign. For Meritaten, this is one of the most important changes in the entire story. The mother whose image once stood beside Akhenaten with such commanding force becomes uncertain, and in that uncertainty the eldest daughter appears to move closer to the space Nefertiti had occupied. The court still needs a great royal woman. The Aten still needs a sacred family. The king still needs visible continuity. If Nefertiti is absent, transformed, dead, renamed, elevated, or politically displaced, then Meritaten's position cannot remain untouched. Nefertiti's disappearance is one of the classic mysteries of the Amarna age because the evidence refuses to settle into one simple answer. Earlier histories often treated her as dying before Akhenaten, perhaps vanishing after the death of one of the royal daughters. Other scholars have proposed that she did not disappear at all, but changed status, possibly becoming a co-regent under another name. Some have linked her to the enigmatic figure Nefertiti, whose identity remains debated. Others remain cautious, arguing that the surviving inscriptions are too fragmentary and politically altered to support any confident reconstruction. No single explanation fully accounts for all the clues. What matters for Meritaten is that Nefertiti's fading presence creates a vacuum in the female side of royal power, and vacuums at court rarely remain empty for long. The official images from earlier Amarna had made Nefertiti almost indispensable. She was not merely the king's wife, but the visible partner in Aten worship, the mother of the royal daughters, and a ritual figure through whom the new religion displayed life, fertility, and order. Her absence, therefore, would have been more than a private loss. It would have disturbed the entire composition of the regime's sacred image. A king alone beneath the Aten could still rule. But the Amarna theology had taught people to see the royal family as a unit. Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and their daughters formed the living household of the god's favour. If the queen's image weakened, the court had to decide how to preserve the pattern. Meritaten, already trained by years of visibility, already recognised as the eldest daughter, already named for the Aten, was the most natural figure to step nearer to the centre. This does not require imagining a dramatic palace coup or secret confrontation. The surviving record gives no safe ground for that kind of story. The shift may have been gradual, administrative, ceremonial, and practical. A title appears here. A scene is altered there. A daughter once shown as a child appears with more mature status. A royal woman receives a role that once belonged to another. At Amarna, power could move through images as much as decrees. The court did not need to explain every rearrangement in words. It could show a new arrangement on stone, and that image would teach officials how to understand the new order. Meritaten's rise, if it coincided with Nefertiti's disappearance, may have been presented not as rupture, but as continuity. There is a deep sadness in the way the record handles royal women at this point. They're everywhere in the art, yet when their actual fates matter most, the record becomes broken and hesitant. Nefertiti's face remains one of the most famous faces from the ancient world, but her ending is uncertain. Meritaten's name survives often enough to prove importance, but not enough to reveal her choices. The younger princesses appear in some scenes, then some fade or die. Their lives preserved only by mourning imagery, titles, or absence. Kia, another royal woman of Akhenaten's court, appears to have held favour and then had her images altered or replaced. The court that once celebrated female visibility now leaves modern scholars sorting through erasures, substitutions, and damaged names. The evidence remains incomplete, and perhaps that incompleteness is part of the Amarna story itself. Meritaten's possible replacement of Nefertiti in certain ceremonial or dynastic functions must be approached carefully. She was not Nefertiti. She did not carry the same years of queenship, the same iconic authority, or the same established partnership with Akhenaten. But she carried something else: direct descent. She was the first daughter of the king and queen, born into the Atenist revolution, and publicly shaped by it from childhood. In a court where legitimacy depended on proximity to Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and the Aten, Meritaten's bloodline and visibility made her valuable. If she later became the great royal wife of Smenkhkare, that value becomes even clearer. But even before Smenkhkare enters the full puzzle, Meritaten's presence near the centre suggests that the court may have been using her to maintain the image of sacred continuity during a time of instability. One lesser-known complexity is that Amarna names themselves can blur identity. Nefertiti also bore the extended name Meritaten and Nefertiti, and some late royal names include forms of Meritaten that have led to long debates about whether they refer to Nefertiti, Meritaten, or another royal figure. These are not small spelling puzzles. In ancient Egypt, names identify sacred and political existence. A throne name, a birth name, an epithet, or a feminine grammatical ending can change how a whole reign is understood. A damaged cartouche can become the centre of decades of argument. Meritaten's fate is tied to this problem, because if Nefertiti became a co-regent under a new name, then Meritaten's rise means one thing. If Nefertiti died and Meritaten assumed some of her roles, it means another. If Meritaten herself became connected to a royal name beyond her familiar titles, the implications become even more dramatic. The emotional reality behind these possibilities is almost impossible to recover. If Nefertiti died, Meritaten may have lost a mother and gained a burden at the same time. If Nefertiti became elevated into a new kingly or co-regent identity, Meritaten may have stood beside a transformed mother whose public role had become even stranger. If Nefertiti was politically displaced, Meritaten may have been drawn into the consequences of court faction and dynastic necessity. The record does not allow certainty, and responsible history must not pretend otherwise. But each scenario shares one truth. Meritaten's life becomes more complicated when Nefertiti's visible queenship no longer functions as it once did. The city around them may still have appeared confident. The Aten's temples continued to receive offerings. Officials still carved loyalty into their tombs. Artists still produced the distinctive royal style. The palaces still held ceremony. But the royal family's internal image was changing. Earlier scenes had shown a flourishing household arranged beneath sunlight. Later evidence suggests absence, mourning, replacement, or transformation. The sacred family that once seemed stable now looks like a structure being repaired while still on display. Meritaten stands near the repair work. She's both daughter and possible substitute, heir to Nefertiti's visibility, and hostage to the same political fragility that made such visibility necessary. In this part of her story, Meritaten becomes harder to see as a young woman separate from the needs of the court. Her identity is pulled toward function. She may be needed to support Akhenaten's final years. She may be needed to legitimize Smenkhkare. She may be needed to preserve Nefertiti's ritual place if the queen is gone. She may be needed simply because the Amarna system has made royal women too important to leave their roles vacant. That is the quiet trap of sacred visibility. Once the court has taught Egypt to see divine order through the royal family, every absence in that family becomes a political problem. So Nefertiti's vanishing does not remove her from Meritaten's story. It makes her presence heavier. The mother becomes a shadow that the daughter must stand beside, behind, or perhaps partly within. The queen's disappearance turns Meritaten from a visible princess into a figure of transition, She is no longer only the beloved child of the Aten. She becomes one of the possible answers to a crisis the evidence never fully explains. And as Nefertiti fades into uncertainty, the question of succession grows sharper, drawing Meritaten toward the most obscure and dangerous figure in the late Amarna drama Smenkhkare, the brief king whose shadow falls across her adult life, and whose existence makes the lost daughter's story even more difficult to untangle. Smenkhkare enters the Amarna story like a figure glimpsed through heat shimmer. He is there, but not long enough to become clear. His name appears in the late turbulence of Akhenaten's world, attached to royal status, surrounded by damaged evidence, and then he is gone almost as quickly as he appears. For Meritaten, his importance is enormous, because she is widely associated with him as great royal wife, and if that association is correct, then her life reaches its most politically charged moment beside one of the most mysterious rulers of ancient Egypt. The daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, raised beneath the Aten, may have stood next to a king whose reign was so brief and obscure that scholars still debate who he was, how he was related to the royal family, and whether he ruled with Akhenaten, after Akhenaten, or in some overlapping shadow of power. The difficulty begins with the name itself. Smenkhkare is known from a limited number of inscriptions and objects, and those traces do not form a neat biography. He appears as a king, but the length of his reign seems very short. He may have ruled for only a year, or perhaps a little more. He may have been a co-regent near the end of Akhenaten's life, sharing royal authority while the older king still lived. He may instead have ruled briefly after Akhenaten's death, trying to hold together a court already strained by religious controversy, dynastic uncertainty, and perhaps deaths within the royal family. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single reconstruction has satisfied every problem. In the world of Amarna studies, Smenkhkare is less a solved person than a pressure point where many uncertainties meet. One of the strongest reasons Meritaten matters here is her title. Evidence links her to Smenkhkare as great royal wife, suggesting that she was not merely a princess lingering in the palace, but the principal royal woman beside a king. In Egyptian terms, this position could carry serious symbolic weight. A great royal wife did not need to command armies or issue decrees in her own name to matter. Her presence could legitimize a ruler, connect him to the royal bloodline, and complete the ceremonial image of kingship. If Smenkhkare's claim required strengthening, Meritaten was an ideal partner. She carried the blood of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. She had been visible since childhood. She was known to the Amarna court as the eldest daughter of the sacred family. By standing beside Smenkhkare, she could help make him appear not as an interruption, but as continuity. The question is why such continuity was needed. Akhenaten's reign had transformed Egypt's religious centre of gravity, but it had also made succession unusually fragile. The king's new theology concentrated sacred meaning in his person and household. This gave his family extraordinary visibility while he lived, but it created danger when the future became uncertain. A traditional monarchy could rely on established gods, temples, priesthoods, and rituals to absorb the shock of succession. Amarna had weakened or displaced many of those older supports at court. If Akhenaten's health declined, if Nefertiti's status changed, if male heirs were young or politically complicated, then the question of who could carry the Atenist order forward became urgent. Smenkhkare appears in that urgency. Some scholars have proposed that Smenkhkare may have been a son of Akhenaten, though evidence for this is not secure. Others have suggested he could have been a younger brother or close male relative. A few older or more speculative theories tried to identify Smenkhkare with Nefertiti under a different royal identity. but many researchers separate Smenkhkare from the female ruler Nefertiti, whose identity is itself debated. These distinctions matter because Meritaten's role changes depending on which possibility is true. If Smenkhkare was Akhenaten's son, Meritaten's marriage to him may have reinforced a direct dynastic line. If he was a brother or other relative, her status as Akhenaten's eldest daughter may have been even more important. If he was a politically chosen successor from within the royal family's broader circle, Meritaten's presence could have been the bridge that made his kingship acceptable. There is a lesser-known but revealing clue in the way some late Amarna objects and inscriptions appear to have shifted ownership or meaning. Names associated with one royal figure may be replaced, altered, or reused by another. Objects prepared for one person may later be adapted. Burial goods, inscriptions, and artistic fragments from the end of the 18th dynasty often carry signs of hurried transition. This does not mean chaos in every room of the palace, but it does suggest a court trying to manage rapid change. Meritaten's connection to Smenkhkare belongs to this atmosphere. The palace may have been arranging titles, marriages, and public images faster than long-term stability could support them. The famous question of Tutankhamun also hangs nearby, though his story does not yet take over the stage. Tutankhamun was still young when he eventually became king, and his reign would mark the return toward older religious traditions. If he was too young or not yet politically ready during the final years of Akhenaten, a figure like Smenkhkare may have served as a necessary adult or near-adult ruler, co-ruler, or transitional king. Meritaten's position beside him would then be even more significant. She could embody the senior female line of Akhenaten's household, while Smenkhkare held royal titles. Together, they may have represented an attempt to keep Amarna alive long enough for succession to settle. What survives in the record suggests a court searching for continuity, but it does not tell us whether that search was confident or desperate. The possibility of a co-regency adds another layer. If Smenkhkare ruled alongside Akhenaten, then Meritaten may have become great royal wife while her father still lived. That would place her in an extraordinary arrangement daughter of the reigning king, wife of a co-regent, and senior royal woman in a court where Nefertiti's role had become uncertain. Such a position would not necessarily mean she wielded independent power, but it would make her central to the public image of transition. If, instead, Smenkhkare ruled only after Akhenaten's death, then Meritaten may have stood at the front of an attempt to preserve the Atenist dynasty after its founder was gone. Either way, her adult life is drawn into the dangerous space between reigns. This is where the calm images of Amarna family life begin to feel almost fragile. Earlier, Meritaten appears as part of a radiant household, surrounded by sisters, parents, ritual, and light. By the time Smenkhkare appears, that household has become a succession puzzle. Nefertiti's fate is uncertain. Some royal daughters have faded from view. Akhenaten's revolution has made enemies or at least deep unease. The older gods are not gone from Egypt's memory. Foreign affairs and internal administration may have added pressure, though scholars still debate the scale and causes of late Amarna difficulties. Into this strained environment comes a brief king and a royal woman whose title suggests that she is being asked to carry more than ceremony. Meritaten's connection to Smenkhkare also reveals how women could become crucial in moments when written political narratives are silent. Ancient Egypt did not leave us a clear court chronicle explaining the succession after Akhenaten. There is no neat statement saying why Smenkhkare was chosen, what Meritaten thought, how Nefertiti's status affected events, or how officials reacted. Instead, historians must work through names, titles, damaged reliefs, jar labels, burial traces, and later restorations. Meritaten appears not as an author of events, but as one of the strongest surviving clues that events were being rearranged. Her marriage or association is political evidence. Her title becomes a signpost in a fog. And then Smenkhkare vanishes. His reign leaves little behind, and his disappearance does not resolve the crisis. It passes the crisis onward. If Meritaten was his great royal wife, then his death or removal would have placed her in another unstable position. She may have been a widow, a former queen, a daughter of a discredited king, a woman tied to a failed transition, or perhaps still someone with enough royal blood to matter. The evidence does not tell us which path she took. It simply grows thinner. The more important she becomes, the more the record seems to fray. Smenkkare's shadow therefore changes Meritaten's story from one of royal childhood into one of high dynastic uncertainty. She's no longer only the beloved daughter beneath the Aten. She's a woman standing beside a king who may have been meant to save the Amarna project, or at least carry it through its most dangerous passage. But his brief reign suggests how little time remained. The city still stands. The temples still face the sun. The titles still claim order. Yet the succession has become a maze of names, missing bodies, and broken inscriptions. Meritaten stands within that maze, close enough to the throne to be indispensable, and close enough to its failure to be swallowed by the same darkness that overtakes Smenkhkare himself. The question of whether Meritaten was ever truly queen depends on what one means by queen. In ancient Egypt, the word can mislead modern ears. A queen might be the principal wife of a king, a royal woman of immense ritual visibility, a mother of royal heirs, a political partner, a symbolic vessel of dynastic legitimacy, or, in rare and complicated cases, a woman who moves close to kingship itself. Meritaten seems to have crossed at least some of those thresholds, but the exact height she reached remains one of the unresolved problems of the late Amarna age. She was certainly born into the highest possible royal circle. She was very likely the great royal wife of Smenkhkare. She may have stood in a position that made her the senior royal woman of the court after Nefertiti's disappearance from ordinary visibility, but whether she ever ruled, co-ruled, or briefly held authority in a way that approached kingship is much harder to prove. Her strongest claim to queenship in the conventional sense rests on her association with Smenkhkare. If she was his great royal wife, then Meritaten was queen beside a king, at least for the brief period in which Smenkhkare held royal status. That alone is significant. She would not have been a forgotten princess waiting in the palace background. She would have stood in the public role once occupied by the chief wife of a ruler, helping complete the image of royal order. In a court so dependent on visual theology, that mattered intensely. The great royal wife was not simply a spouse. She could appear in ritual, support kingship, embody dynastic fertility, and serve as a link between ruler and royal lineage. Meritaten's blood made that link unusually powerful. She was the daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, and any ruler attached to her gained proximity to the sacred family of Amarna. But the harder question lies beyond that. Could Meritaten herself have held a royal identity more directly? Some interpretations of late Amarna names and inscriptions have explored whether a female ruler or co-regent, often known through the name Nefertiti, might be connected not only to Nefertiti but possibly to Meritaten. This is one of the most tangled debates of the period. Many scholars favour Nefertiti as the likely identity behind Nefertiti, especially because Nefertiti already bore the expanded name Nefertiti and had exceptional status. Others have considered alternative identifications, including Meritaten, though these remain more debated. The evidence is fragmentary, and damaged cartouches can carry enormous interpretive weight. A single epithet, a feminine ending, or a phrase referring to Akhenaten as beloved can shift the argument. No single explanation fully accounts for all the surviving pieces. For a sleep documentary, it is tempting to soften the debate into a simple mystery. Perhaps Meritaten was pharaoh, but that would go further than the evidence safely allows. Mainstream caution is important here. Meritaten was likely a queen in the sense of great royal wife, if her association with Smenkhkare is accepted. She may have assumed ceremonial roles left open by Nefertiti's absence. She may have carried major dynastic importance during the succession crisis. Yet the case for Meritaten ruling as king, or as a formal co-regent in her own right, remains uncertain and less widely accepted than some more cautious possibilities. Scholars still debate the identity and sequence of late Amarna rulers, and Meritaten's name is one of the pieces in that debate, not a solved answer. Still, the fact that her name can even enter such arguments shows how unusual her position was. Most royal daughters never approach this level of historical possibility. They may be named, married, buried, and honoured, but they do not become plausible candidates in debates over rulership. Meritaten does because Amarna unsettled the boundaries of royal womanhood. Nefertiti had already been shown with extraordinary authority. Female figures in the late reign appear in ways that blur the line between queenly ritual and kingly symbolism. The old structures had been bent by Akhenaten's revolution, and once a court begins bending sacred forms, it can become harder to restore fixed limits. Meritaten lives inside that flexibility. She may not have ruled Egypt, but she moved in a world where royal women could stand closer to kingship than usual. The title Great Royal Wife itself is worth lingering over. It does not always tell us everything about political power, but it reveals rank. A great royal wife could be the leading queen among several royal women. She could be central to ritual scenes and dynastic display. Her titles might include references to beauty, favour, royal love, or divine connection. In Meritaten's case, the title would have carried an additional layer because of her parentage. She was not an outsider married into the line. She was the line, or at least one of its most visible living continuations. If Smenkkare's legitimacy was fragile, Meritaten's queenship could strengthen it. If Akhenaten was still alive during a co-regency, her role could help stage a transition without admitting weakness. If Akhenaten had died, her status could help present Smenkhkare as the proper heir to the Atenist order. There is a lesser-known tension in the way royal women's names can be replaced or appropriated in Amarna monuments. Kia, a secondary wife or favoured woman of Akhenaten, had inscriptions and images that seem in some cases to have been altered for Meritaten or other princesses. Such alterations are not just acts of vandalism or thrift. They reveal changing favour, changing needs, and perhaps changing politics. If a monument made for one woman becomes associated with another, this stone itself records a shift in court hierarchy. Meritaten's rise may therefore be visible not only in new honours, but in the reworking of older material. The past of the court could be edited to serve the present, and a woman's prominence could grow through the erasure of someone else's. This should not be read too dramatically, as if every altered inscription proves a personal rivalry. Ancient court politics could be practical and impersonal in ways modern imagination often resists. Names were changed because status changed, because a person died, because a new royal woman became more important, because a workshop reused available material, or because later regimes tried to reshape memory. The evidence remains incomplete. But the pattern reminds us that Meritaten's position was not static. She lived in a court where female visibility was actively managed. Her titles were not mere ornaments, they were part of a competitive symbolic field. If she became queen beside Smenkhkare, Meritaten may have occupied rooms, ceremonies, and expectations once associated with Nefertiti. She may have appeared in formal dress, received honours, joined rituals, and been named in ways that presented her as the chief royal woman. She may also have had to navigate a court where everyone understood that the Amarna project was vulnerable. The older priesthoods had not been permanently destroyed. The memory of Amun remained powerful. The empire's foreign network still required attention. Egypt's administrative elites may have been divided in their loyalties, or at least cautious in their commitments. In such a world, queenship was not only prestige, it was exposure. Meritaten's possible queenship also raises the issue of motherhood, though here the record becomes especially uncertain. Some late Amarna figures and names have led to speculation about royal children, but the evidence does not allow a secure reconstruction of Meritaten as mother of a known successor. Ancient Egyptian royal women often gained power through producing heirs, yet Meritaten's historical importance does not depend on a confirmed child. Her value lay in her direct descent from Akhenaten and Nefertiti, her visibility in the Atenist family, and her possible role in legitimizing Smenkhkare. If she had children, the record has not preserved them clearly enough for confidence. If she did not, or if they did not become politically central, her role still mattered during the brief, unstable transition. The question of whether she was ever queen, therefore, has two answers. The cautious answer is yes, probably, if we mean great royal wife of Smenkhkare. The broader answer is that her queenship belongs to a foggy edge of kingship, where titles, family, succession, and religious crisis overlap. She was queen enough to matter. She was close enough to the throne that later historians cannot ignore her, but she was not preserved clearly enough for us to draw a clean line around her authority. Like so much at Amarna, her status is visible in flashes: a title, a name, a possible replacement, a dynastic connection, a role implied by absence. And perhaps that is why Meritaten continues to feel so haunting. She stands at a threshold. Behind her is childhood beneath the Aten, beside Akhenaten and Nefertiti in scenes of sacred family life. Around her is the strange flexibility of Amarna, where queens can look almost kingly, and daughters can become symbols of political survival. Before her is a collapsing experiment that will soon be rewritten by those who restore the older gods. If she was queen, it was likely in the narrow, dangerous corridor between Akhenaten's certainty and Egypt's reversal. She may have worn the title, stood beside a brief king, and carried the final brightness of her parents' revolution. But the moment is so short that history barely catches it. Meritaten becomes queen like sunlight on a broken wall, real enough to see, impossible to hold, and gone almost before the eye understands what it has found. By the time Meritaten stands near queenship, the Amarna court is no longer merely a place of dazzling invention. It is a court under pressure, and pressure changes the meaning of every image. The Aten still shines in the reliefs. The offering tables still overflow. Akhenaten's theology still speaks in the language of certainty, as if the sun itself has settled all arguments. Yet the late Amarna years feel different from the early dream of founding a new horizon. The royal family has become less stable. Nefertiti's role is uncertain. Smenkhkare appears briefly and obscurely. Some princesses fade from the record. The succession grows tangled. Beyond the palace, Egypt remains a large and complicated kingdom whose old religious habits, foreign obligations, economic systems, and local loyalties cannot simply be remade by sunlight and decree. Meritaten's adult life unfolds in that tightening atmosphere, where the city still performs confidence while history begins to show strain. The first pressure is religious. Akhenaten's revolution had not only elevated the Aten, it had also disrupted the sacred networks that had helped hold Egypt together. Temples were not merely places of prayer, they were landholders, employers, storehouses, ritual centers, and engines of local identity. The great temple complexes, especially those associated with Amun, had deep economic and social roots. To diminish them was not like changing a royal fashion. It meant disturbing institutions that fed priests, artisans, farmers, scribes, and entire communities of service. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate how fully Atenism penetrated life outside the royal centre. But the basic tension is clear. Akhenaten's court wanted a new sacred order. Egypt's older religious world had centuries of momentum behind it. This tension must have touched Meritaten indirectly, even if the court never admitted it in public. As the king's daughter and possible queen, she belonged to the visible face of the new order. Her name praised Aten. Her public identity depended on the success of her father's transformation. If older cults regained strength, or if officials began quietly preparing for restoration, Meritaten's position became more fragile. She was not merely a royal woman. She was a royal woman branded by a controversial theology. In a more ordinary reign, a princess might survive political shifts by remaining part of the broader dynastic house. Meritaten's difficulty was that her image, titles, and childhood were inseparable from Amarna. If Amarna fell, part of her identity fell with it. The second pressure was dynastic. A revolution can survive only if succession is managed. Akhenaten's intense focus on the Aten and the royal family made his household the central symbol of life and truth, but the household itself appears to have suffered losses and rearrangements. One of the most moving and debated scenes from Amarna shows mourning around a royal female figure, often interpreted in connection with the death of Meritaten, one of Meritaten's sisters. The details remain uncertain, and the scene should not be forced into more certainty than it can bear. But it suggests that the royal family experienced grief within the official world of sacred images. Other daughters become harder to trace. Nefertiti's disappearance from familiar visibility adds another layer. The family that once seemed complete beneath the Aten begins to look wounded. For Meritaten, this may have meant a rapid increase in expectation. In stable times, the eldest daughter's rank might be ceremonial, prestigious, and carefully managed. In unstable times, it could become urgent. A daughter could be married to strengthen succession. A royal woman could replace another in ritual scenes. A title could be elevated because a role needed filling. Meritaten's possible marriage to Smenkhkare belongs to exactly this kind of pressure. It may have been a solution, or at least an attempted solution, to a problem the record does not explain clearly. The court needed a future. Meritaten could help symbolize one, but symbolism is not the same as safety, and the very need to use her so visibly may reveal how uncertain the future had become. The third pressure came from beyond Egypt's borders. The Amarna letters, diplomatic tablets written in cuneiform, preserve correspondence between Egypt and rulers, vassals, and powers of the Near East. They do not give us Meritaten's private world, but they reveal the wider stage on which her family ruled. Local rulers wrote about loyalty, conflict, requests for gold, military anxieties, and shifting power. The Near East of the Late Bronze Age was a world of alliances, rival kingdoms, marriages, gifts, and strategic threats. Egypt was still a great power, but greatness required attention. Akhenaten's court was not ruling a secluded desert dream. It was responsible for a network of relationships stretching far beyond the Nile Valley. Scholars still debate how severely Akhenaten's religious focus affected foreign policy, and older claims of total neglect are often treated with caution. But the letters show a world that needed active management. Meritaten would not have been reading these tablets in the manner of a foreign minister, as far as the evidence shows. Yet their existence matters because they remind us that Amarna's glowing family scenes were only one surface of kingship. While the Aten shone over offering courts, officials dealt with messages from Canaan, Syria, Mitanni, Babylonia, Assyria, and other powers. Marriage diplomacy, gift exchange, and military concerns all belong to the same royal house in which Meritaten lived. If the court was distracted, divided, or weakened by succession uncertainty, foreign relationships could feel the tremor. The Amarna experiment was not tested only by Egyptian priests or later memory. It was tested by the practical demands of ruling an empire. The fourth pressure may have been environmental or economic, though this must be handled with care. Some have imagined Amarna as a city of hardship beneath the blazing sun, filled with overworked labourers and strained supply systems. Archaeological evidence from non-royal cemeteries has suggested difficult lives for many ordinary inhabitants, including signs of heavy labour and health stress. But it is too simple to turn this into a single story of famine or collapse. Ancient populations often show physical stress, and interpreting skeletal evidence requires caution. What can be said is that Akhenaten was built quickly, populated rapidly, and sustained by a system that demanded constant provisioning. A new capital in the desert does not feed itself. Its beauty depended on grain, water, labour, animals, transport, and administration. Any disruption in that system would have made the royal dream more expensive to maintain. The official art refuses to show such strain. It shows abundance. It shows offerings piled high, the royal family radiant, and the Aten extending life. This contrast is one of the most important hidden contradictions of Amarna. The court's images insist on effortless divine plenty, while archaeology reminds us of human cost. Meritaten lived at the privileged centre of that contrast. Her palace world may have held cool interiors, fine linen, jewellery, music, and carefully prepared food, while nearby labourers carried stone, mixed plaster, served estates, and supplied the temples. This is not unique to Amarna. All ancient royal systems rested on labour, but at Amarna the contradiction feels sharper because the city's ideology is so bright, so insistent, and so focused on life-giving light. The more the art proclaims harmony, the more the broken remains invite us to ask who paid for it. The fifth pressure was memory itself. Even before the Amarna period ended, the court must have known that its revolution had enemies or doubters. The older gods had not vanished from Egypt's deep imagination. Amun's name could be attacked on monuments, but Amun's absence from official stone did not erase generations of devotion. Local religious life, funerary beliefs, family traditions, and priestly networks had roots no single reign could fully destroy. Meritaten's world may have seemed dominant inside Akhenaten, but dominance at court is not the same as acceptance everywhere. The evidence remains incomplete, yet the speed with which restoration followed suggests that the old order had been waiting, surviving, or at least remained available as soon as political conditions changed. In this atmosphere, Meritaten's personal fate becomes inseparable from the fate of the experiment. She's not merely a young woman in a palace drama. She's a living sign of whether Amarna can continue. If she stands beside Smenkhkare, she helps answer the dynastic question. If she assumes roles once associated with Nefertiti, she helps answer the ceremonial question. If she remains visible in Atenist contexts, she helps answer the religious question. But each answer depends on a system already under strain. Her importance rises because the court needs her, and the court needs her because its foundations are no longer secure. The tragedy is that Amarna could still look successful while it was beginning to fail. Buildings stood, offerings continued, officials used the language of loyalty. The sun rose every morning over the cliffs exactly as Akhenaten had promised. No heavenly sign announced that the city's future was short. Meritaten may have moved through ceremonies that still felt eternal, wearing titles that still carried weight, surrounded by people who still bowed and recorded and arranged the world around her. Yet beneath the formal rhythm, too many uncertainties were gathering: religion unsettled, succession unclear, foreign affairs demanding attention, royal women disappearing or changing roles, older traditions waiting beyond the city's borders. A court under pressure does not always break loudly. Sometimes it keeps singing the same hymn, carving the same rays, offering the same bread, and painting the same sunlight until the moment after which the song no longer persuades. Meritaten stands in that late brightness. She is close to power, but power is becoming unstable. She is close to the Aten, but the Aten's exclusive reign is nearing its end. She is close to the throne, but the throne itself is about to turn toward a different future. The city built from nothing has not yet been abandoned, but already the air around it feels thinner, as if the desert horizon is beginning to reclaim what the king once declared eternal. When Tutankhamun begins to emerge from the ruins of Amarna, he does not arrive as a conqueror smashing the city gates. He arrives as a young king surrounded by older hands, inherited problems, and a court that seems to understand something Akhenaten's city never admitted openly: Egypt cannot be held forever inside one man's sunlight. At first, even his own name belongs to the Aten. He is Tutankhamun, the living image of Aten, a child of the same religious world that shaped Meritaten. But within a few years, the name changes. Tutankhamun becomes Tutankhamun, the living image of Amun. Ankhesenpaten, another daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, becomes Ankhesenamun. Names turn like weather vanes in a shifting wind, and with those changes the Amarna revolution begins to retreat from the centre of Egyptian life. For Meritaten, this return is both historical turning point and deepening darkness. Her record is already fragile by the time Tutankhamun's restoration takes shape. She has stood beneath the Aten as eldest daughter, perhaps beside Smenkhkare as great royal wife, perhaps near the centre during the court's final attempt to preserve continuity. But as the restoration of Amun gathers force, Meritaten becomes harder to trace. The new order does not need her in the way Amarna needed her. It needs a different story, not the sacred family of Akhenaten under the Aten, but the healing of Egypt after a time of disruption. In that story, the living figures who can be repositioned are useful. Those too closely tied to the failed experiment become inconvenient. The return to older gods was not simply a religious correction in the abstract. It was a rebuilding of institutions, rituals, and legitimacy. Amun's temples had to be honoured again. Traditional priesthoods had to regain place. The language of kingship had to reconnect with the gods who had long supported Egypt's understanding of order. The restoration, stela associated with Tutankhamun, presents the country as having suffered from neglect of the gods. With temples fallen into disrepair and divine favour needing renewal, the language is official and ideological. not a neutral report, and scholars still debate how literally to take its claims, but its message is unmistakable. The court wants to say that Egypt is being repaired. The old divine world is returning. The mistake is being corrected. This correction did not require every trace of Amarna to vanish immediately. History rarely turns so cleanly. Officials who had served under Akhenaten may have continued under later rulers. Artists trained in Amarna styles may have adapted. Administrative habits did not disappear overnight. People who once praised the Aten could learn to praise Amen again, especially if survival at court required flexibility. Yet the direction of travel is clear. The capital shifts away from Akhenaten. The exclusive centrality of the Aten weakens. The royal family's names are altered. The gods that Akhenaten tried to diminish re-enter the formal language of power. The city that had been built to embody a new horizon begins to lose its reason for existing. Tutankhamun himself was likely too young to drive all of this policy personally in its early stages. That is not an insult to him, but a practical reality of kingship. A young ruler could carry immense symbolic authority, while experienced officials guided decisions. Figures such as A and Horemheb stand near the later transition, representing the older political and military experience that would help Egypt move beyond Amarna. The evidence remains incomplete, and the precise balance of influence is debated, but Tutankhamun's reign clearly becomes the vehicle for restoration. His body carries the crown. The court around him carries the work of turning Egypt back toward familiar sacred ground. Meritaten's place in this new arrangement is difficult to imagine, because the evidence does not preserve her securely within it. If she was still alive, she may have been politically awkward. She was the eldest daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, possibly the widow or former great royal wife of Smenkhkare, and a woman whose public identity had been shaped by Atenist imagery from childhood. Her name itself praised the Aten. In a court trying to restore Amun and distance itself from Akhenaten's radicalism, Meritaten's symbolic value would have changed dramatically. Once, she proved the revolution's continuity. Now, she may have reminded people of the revolution's danger. This does not mean she was necessarily punished, imprisoned, or dramatically removed. The record does not allow such claims, and unsupported drama would distort the history. Ancient courts could make people disappear from prominence without leaving theatrical traces. A title could stop being used. A woman could retire into a less visible household. A death could occur without surviving burial evidence. A name could be omitted because it no longer served political memory. A royal woman could be absorbed into the silence that surrounds so many ancient lives. No single explanation fully accounts for Meritaten's disappearance, but the restoration makes that disappearance easier to understand. The world that made her visible was being dismantled. The movement away from Amarna also affected the physical spaces of memory. Akhenaten had been designed for the Aten, and without Atenist kingship it became increasingly unnecessary. Its temples and palaces did not carry the deep sacred authority of Thebes or Memphis. They were too closely tied to one reign, one doctrine, one family. As the court left, the city's grand spaces became vulnerable. Some areas may have remained inhabited for a time, but the capital's central function faded. Buildings were abandoned, materials reused, and the desert began its patient work. The painted floors, open courts, and royal roads that once organized Meritaten's life became ruins. A city built to preserve divine truth became an archaeological problem. There is a lesser-known irony in Tutankhamun's return to Amun. The young king is remembered today more vividly than almost any pharaoh, not because his reign restored Egypt in grand military triumph, but because his tomb survived with extraordinary richness. Yet his life was partly shaped by the collapse of the very family that made Meritaten visible. He comes after the blaze. His reign is a correction, a pivot, a careful reweaving of broken threads. Meritaten, by contrast, belongs to the blaze itself. She is visible in the heat of the experiment and then obscured in the cooling that follows. Modern fame has favoured the king of the Restoration, while the daughter of the Revolution remains a fragment. The name changes are perhaps the most intimate signs of this wider transformation. Tutankhaten to Tutankhamun, Ankhesenpaten to Ankhesenamun. Aten yields to Amun inside the bodies of royal names. In ancient Egypt, this was not cosmetic. Names carried identity, divine relationship, and political allegiance. To change a name was to reposition a person within the cosmos. Meritaten's name, however, is not known to undergo such a clear transformation. That may be because she had vanished from prominence before the Restoration fully took hold, or because the evidence has not survived, or because her continued Atenist name made her less usable in the restored order. Scholars still debate the sequence of late Amarna figures, and the missing details matter, but the contrast is striking. Others are renamed for the future. Meritaten remains named for the past. So as Tutankhamun's court turns back toward Amun, Meritaten slips into the widening gap between official correction and human memory. She is not the centre of the Restoration. She is one of the people the Restoration leaves behind. The Aten city fades. The old gods return. The young king's new name announces a different sacred loyalty. The royal family of Akhenaten, once carved as the living heart of divine truth, becomes something later Egypt will prefer to soften, avoid, or erase. Meritaten's life, so carefully displayed in Amarna's sunlight, now enters the shadow cast by recovery. Egypt moves on, and the lost daughter becomes harder to follow, precisely because the country has found a way to continue without her. After Amarna, memory itself becomes a battlefield, though not always in the dramatic way modern imagination expects. There is no need to picture a single night of destruction. Torches moving through empty palaces, names hacked away in one furious command. The erasure of Akhenaten's world is slower, more administrative, and in some ways more devastating. Buildings are dismantled, stones are reused, names are omitted from king lists, inscriptions are altered. The official line of Egyptian kingship learns to step around the Amarna period as if it were a wound in the royal body. Meritaten is caught inside this process. She is not erased as completely as Akhenaten, and yet she is not preserved with the honour that might have belonged to a secure queen of the 18th dynasty. She survives in fragments because the world that named her became dangerous to remember. The ancient Egyptian attack on memory worked through names and images. To modern eyes, a chiselled-out cartouche or a damaged figure may look like vandalism. In Egypt, it meant something deeper. A name was not merely a label, it was part of a person's continued existence. An image was not merely representation, it could carry presence, status, and ritual life. To damage a name or remove a figure was to interrupt memory at a sacred level. Akhenaten's name and the names connected to Atenist rule became targets because later rulers wanted to restore continuity with the older religious order. They did not simply dislike him as a failed politician, they treated his reign as an interruption in Ma'at, the balanced order of the world. Meritaten's difficulty is that her name, her identity, and her public life were inseparable from that interruption. Her name itself becomes a problem. Meritaten means beloved of Aten, and after the restoration of Amun, that name must have sounded like a relic of the rejected age. Some members of the royal family could be renamed in ways that aligned them with the restored gods. Tutankhaten became Tutankhamun. Ankhesenpaten became Ankhesenamun. These changes allowed living or politically useful figures to be folded into the new order. Meritaten is harder to fold. The evidence does not clearly show her reappearing under an Amun name. Perhaps she was already dead. Perhaps she had lost political relevance. Perhaps her record has simply not survived. The evidence remains incomplete, but the silence is telling. She remains known to us by the name of the god whose exclusive worship later Egypt tried to undo. The physical dismantling of Amarna deepens the problem. Akhenaten was built quickly, and its decorated blocks were well suited to reuse. Talatat stones, once part of Aten temples and royal scenes, could be carried away, buried in new construction, or hidden inside later monuments. In practical terms, this was efficient. Stone was valuable. A discredited city provided ready material. But for historians, it created a shattered archive. Reliefs that once formed continuous scenes were broken into pieces and scattered. A princess's head might be found far from her body. A name might survive without the scene that explained it. A ray of the Aten might appear without the royal figure it once touched. Meritaten's world was not preserved as a ruin left respectfully in place. It was taken apart and turned into building material for a future that no longer wanted her family's story intact. This is why the reconstruction of Meritaten's life feels so unstable. Egyptologists are not working with a royal autobiography or a complete palace archive. They're working with fragments, tomb scenes of officials, inscriptions on objects, altered names, reused blocks, traces of titles, and comparisons between damaged pieces. A little evidence can carry enormous weight. A title such as Great Royal Wife can reshape her entire adult biography. A replaced name can suggest a shift in favour. A missing figure can open several competing possibilities. Scholars still debate many of these details because the material does not speak in a single voice. It whispers from broken stone, and those whispers do not always agree. Some of the most frustrating clues are the altered monuments associated with royal women. The Amarna court included Nefertiti, Meritaten, her sisters, Kia, and other female figures whose names and images could be changed as political needs shifted. In some cases, inscriptions first made for one woman seem to have been replaced with the name of another. This may reflect death, demotion, elevation, reuse, or later correction. Meritaten may have benefited from such replacement during her rise, especially if she became more important in the late court. Yet the same habit of alteration later makes her harder to understand. The court edited its own memory before later Egypt edited it again. By the time modern scholars arrive, they are reading a text revised by multiple hands, some loyal to Amarna, some hostile to it, and all separated from us by more than 3,000 years. A lesser-known complication is that ancient erasure was often selective rather than total. Later rulers did not always destroy every trace of the Amarna period immediately or consistently. Some names survived because they were overlooked. Some stones were hidden rather than exposed. Some objects passed into new contexts. Some officials who had served Akhenaten continued careers under later kings, adjusting their loyalties without advertising contradiction. This unevenness is both a gift and a curse. It allows Meritaten to survive at all, but it also means survival can be accidental. A fragment may exist not because someone wanted to preserve her, but because someone failed to destroy or notice it. Her presence in history depends partly on ancient neglect. The king lists reveal the larger act of exclusion. Later official traditions often move from Amenhotep III to Horemheb, bypassing Akhenaten, Smenkhkare, Tutankhamun, and in ways that smoothed over the disruption. This was political memory made neat. It allowed Egypt to pretend that the line of legitimate order had not passed through the strange sunlight of Amarna. Meritaten, as a royal woman rather than a named king in those lists, disappears even more easily. Male rulers could be omitted from formal sequence. A daughter or queen could vanish with hardly any official trace at all. Her erasure is therefore quieter, but no less real. She is lost not only because her own life was poorly recorded, but because the historical framework that might have held her was deliberately rearranged. And yet, broken clues can also preserve truths that official memory tried to suppress. The very fragments that survive show that Akhenaten's family was once central, visible, and elaborately honoured. Meritaten's repeated appearance proves that she mattered. Her possible adult titles prove that her role expanded. The damaged stones show not absence alone, but former presence. Every broken image of the Aten's rays, every altered cartouche, every reused block from a dismantled temple is evidence that something once stood strongly enough to be worth dismantling. Meritaten's world was not a minor court fashion. It was a royal and religious system powerful enough to reshape Egypt briefly, and troubling enough that later Egypt worked to contain its memory. The frustration is that the most human details vanish first. Erasure can leave politics while destroying personality. We can trace the collapse of Atenism more easily than we can trace Meritaten's thoughts. We can identify the pressure of restoration more clearly than we can identify her final years. We can say that her image was used, altered, and partially preserved, but not whether she feared the change, accepted it, resisted it, or had no room to act at all. The record gives us a royal woman caught between two memory systems, one that displayed her as sacred, and another that had little reason to remember her kindly. So Meritaten remains among the broken clues. Her story must be assembled from damaged names, reused stones, incomplete scenes, and the negative space left by erasure. She is not entirely gone, but she is never whole. The city that made her visible was dismantled. The god in her name was displaced. The family that raised her into sacred light was treated as a dangerous deviation. Later, Egypt restored its older rhythms and moved forward. But beneath those restored temples, inside walls built from older blocks, fragments of Amarna still waited. Somewhere in that buried brightness, Meritaten endured not as a voice, not as a complete life, but as a name the chisels did not fully silence. Meritaten's end is not marked by a clear tomb door, a complete burial inscription, or a final court record that allows the story to close cleanly. She fades in the same way much of Amarna fades through broken names, uncertain titles, shifting identities, and silence where a royal woman's fate should be. This silence is not empty. It is crowded with possibilities. She may have died young, perhaps during the unstable years around the end of Akhenaten's reign. She may have survived into the restoration and lost visibility because her Atenist identity became politically inconvenient. She may have been buried in a royal tomb that was later disturbed, reused, or never securely identified. She may even have lived under a name or status that the surviving record no longer lets us connect to her with confidence. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for her disappearance. The simplest possibility is early death. Ancient royal status did not protect anyone from the limits of the ancient body. Disease, complications of health, infection, and the ordinary vulnerabilities of life could reach palaces as surely as villages. The Amarna royal family seems to have suffered losses during the later years of Akhenaten's reign, and scenes of mourning connected to royal women remind us that the sacred family was not immune to mortality. Meritaten may have died before the restoration fully unfolded, leaving no long later career to record. If she had been great royal wife of Smenkhkare, and if Smenkhkare himself ruled only briefly, then her window of adult prominence may have been very narrow. A short queenship followed by death would explain why she appears important but then vanishes quickly. Yet early death, while possible, does not answer everything. If Meritaten died as a major royal woman, especially as great royal wife, one might expect more secure burial evidence, though Amarna's later destruction complicates that expectation. Royal tombs were robbed, unfinished, altered, or reused. Bodies were moved, names were damaged. Burial goods could be taken, reassigned, or discovered far from their intended context. The late 18th dynasty is famous not for clean funerary clarity, but for confusion. The tomb of Tutankhamun survived because of unusual circumstances. Most royal burials were far more disturbed. Meritaten may once have had a burial worthy of her rank, only for its signs to be scattered beyond recognition. Absence of evidence is not evidence of a quiet life. Sometimes it is evidence of a violent history of reuse, robbery, and political forgetting. Another possibility is political obscurity after the restoration. If Meritaten survived beyond Smenkhkare and into the reign of Tutankhamun, her position would have been delicate. She was too closely tied to Akhenaten's world to be an easy symbol of restored order. Her name praised Aten. Her childhood had been carved into Amarna's sacred family imagery. Her possible queenship belonged to a transitional ruler whose memory did not endure. The restored court may have had little reason to display her. She could have lived in diminished status, respected privately perhaps, but no longer useful in public ritual. Ancient royal women could disappear from official prominence without dramatic recorded punishment. A palace does not need to destroy someone in order to stop showing her. It only needs to stop naming her. This kind of disappearance may be the hardest for modern minds because it leaves no satisfying ending. A woman once central to state imagery simply becomes unnecessary. The scenes change. The gods change. The living court reorders itself around new priorities. If Meritaten remained alive, she may have watched younger figures become more useful to the restored order. Tutankhamun and Akhenaten could be renamed toward Amun and integrated into the new religious story. Meritaten, perhaps older, perhaps widowed, perhaps marked too strongly by Atenist titles, may have had no comparable place. What survives in the record suggests that political usefulness often determined visibility, and once her usefulness faded, so did her trace. A third possibility is renamed identity, the most alluring and dangerous kind of hypothesis. The Amarna period is full of names that change, overlap, and appear in damaged form. Nefertiti's extended name, Nefertiti, the debated female ruler associated with late Amarna, and the fragmentary records of Smenkhkare create a maze of possible identifications. Some have wondered whether Meritaten might be hidden behind one of these late royal names, perhaps occupying a role more elevated than conventional queenship. But this remains uncertain and should not be treated as fact. Many scholars see Nefertiti as a stronger candidate for certain late identities, while others caution that the evidence is too damaged for full confidence. Meritaten may be part of the debate because her position was important, but importance is not proof of kingship. Still, the possibility matters because it reveals the instability of the period. If a royal woman could be renamed, elevated, or represented through titles that later became obscure, then Meritaten's disappearance might be partly an illusion created by the record. She may not vanish at the moment her familiar name fades. She may continue under another title, another role, or within a fragment whose original identity has been lost. Ancient Egypt's royal naming system could preserve power while hiding biography. A throne name could tell us little about the childhood name behind it. A damaged feminine epithet could point towards several women. Meritaten might be absent, or she might be present in a form we cannot securely recognize. Scholars still debate these possibilities because the record offers hints without enough anchors. A fourth possibility is burial somewhere in the Amarna royal landscape. Akhenaten prepared royal tombs in the cliffs near his new city, and members of the royal family were likely intended to rest within that sacred geography. Some burial scenes and chambers suggest royal deaths during the Amarna period, though the identities and sequence are difficult to establish. Meritaten may have been buried in or near Akhenaten, especially if she died before the court fully abandoned the city. But after the restoration, royal remains associated with Amarna may have been moved, disturbed, or left vulnerable. The later relocation of royal mummies and the tangled history of tomb reuse in the Valley of the Kings show how unstable royal burial could become. If Meritaten's body was moved, renamed, or separated from identifying objects, finding her with certainty becomes nearly impossible. There is also the possibility that she was buried outside Amarna after the court returned to older centres of power. If she survived into the restoration, a burial at Thebes or in another royal context is not impossible. But again, the evidence does not give a secure match. Some unidentified female mummies from the late 18th dynasty have inspired speculation, but without firm inscriptions or genetic and archaeological clarity, attaching Meritaten's name to a body would be premature. Modern science has transformed the study of royal remains, but even DNA cannot solve every historical identity when family relationships are close. Samples are limited, and archaeological contexts are disturbed. The desire to find Meritaten is understandable. The responsible answer is that she has not yet been securely found. Her disappearance also reflects the fate of many women in ancient records. Even royal women, when not mothers of famous kings or holders of unusually long power, often become visible only when they serve dynastic storytelling. Meritaten was visible because Amarna needed her. Once that need ended, her record narrowed. This does not mean her life became meaningless. It means the surviving state record stopped caring enough to preserve it. There is a quiet cruelty in that, though it's not personal in the modern sense. Ancient memory was selective. It saved what power required and let the rest fall away. Meritaten's final years may have contained grief, adaptation, quiet influence, or ordinary royal routine, but the record gives us no safe way to narrate those details as fact. So her end remains suspended among competing explanations: early death, political obscurity, renamed identity, lost burial, a life absorbed into restoration, a queen whose reign-adjacent importance ended with Smenkhkare, a daughter of Nefertiti who outlived her world but not its memory. Each possibility has strengths, and each leaves gaps. What survives in the record suggests that Meritaten came close to the centre of power during one of Egypt's most unstable transitions, then disappeared when the story turned away from Amarna. That may be the closest we can come to certainty. She did not vanish because she was unimportant. She vanished because she belonged to a world later Egypt worked hard to bury. Meritaten still reveals something important precisely because she is incomplete. If her life were fully known, if her tomb was securely identified, if a long inscription described her duties, marriage, death, and burial, She might seem easier to place within the familiar order of royal biography. Instead, she remains broken across the record, and that brokenness makes her one of the most revealing figures of Amarna. Through her, we see not only a daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, but the way ancient Egypt used family as sacred language, the way religious revolution depended on bodies and images, the way royal women could become central without becoming fully audible, and the way a civilization could preserve a person in stone while allowing her actual life to vanish. Her first revelation is about family. Amarna made the royal household unusually visible. Akhenaten, Nefertiti, Meritaten, and the other daughters appear together in scenes that still feel intimate, even after every caution about propaganda and symbolism. The family is not hidden behind palace walls. It becomes the public face of theology. Meritaten's presence tells us that the Amarna revolution was not expressed only through temples, hymns, and royal decrees. It was expressed through the image of parents and children under sunlight. The daughters helped make the Atenist order feel alive. They turned doctrine into flesh. They showed continuity, fertility, and divine favour in a form that officials and viewers could recognise instantly. What survives in the record suggests that the royal family itself became a kind of living ritual object. That revelation should not be softened into sentimentality. The same imagery that makes Meritaten seem close also shows how little separation existed between private identity and public use. A royal daughter could be loved, but she could also be displayed. She could belong to a family, but that family belonged to the state. Her childhood gestures, her rank among her sisters, her closeness to Nefertiti, and her name praising the Aten were all folded into the religious message of the reign. Amarna family scenes may preserve warmth, but they also reveal a court where affection could be transformed into ideology. Meritaten reminds us that ancient royal childhood, especially at the highest level, was never simply personal. It was ceremonial from the beginning. Her second revelation is about faith. Through Meritaten, the Atenist revolution becomes less abstract. It is easy to describe Akhenaten's religious reforms in terms of gods, temples, priesthoods, and official policy. But Meritaten shows how that reform entered human identity. Her very name binds her to the Aten. Her earliest images place her beneath the gods' rays. Her adult importance grows within a system that claims life flows through Aten, king, queen, and royal family. She is not a theologian whose writings survive. She is not the author of a hymn, yet her body in art becomes part of the doctrine. The evidence remains incomplete, but it suggests that Atenism did not simply change what Egypt worshipped. It changed how royal persons were made meaningful. That faith also reveals its fragility through her. A name that once elevated her later made her harder to absorb into the restored order. Beloved of Aten was a powerful identity while Akhenaten's sun religion dominated the court. After the return to Amun, the same name belonged to a discredited horizon. Meritaten's life shows how dangerous it can be when a person's status is tied too closely to a political theology. When the theology falls, the person does not necessarily fall by action or punishment. Sometimes she falls by becoming unusable in the new story. Meritaten's silence after Amarna is one of the quiet costs of restored order. Her third revelation concerns female power. Nefertiti's prominence has long drawn attention, but Meritaten shows that Amarna's unusual royal womanhood extended beyond the queen herself. The daughters were not hidden. The eldest daughter could grow into a woman of dynastic significance. Meritaten may have become great royal wife of Smenkhkare, and perhaps senior royal woman at a moment when Nefertiti's status becomes uncertain. She stands close to the centre during a succession crisis. And that closeness matters. It shows that royal women could act as bridges of legitimacy, especially when the male line was fragile, unclear, or politically complicated. Yet Meritaten also reveals the limits of that power. We can see her importance, but not her decisions. We can reconstruct her usefulness, but not her voice. She may have held titles, stood beside a king, and carried the bloodline of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, but the surviving record does not let us know how much agency she exercised. Scholars still debate whether she was mainly a symbolic partner, a political instrument, a ceremonial leader, or something more active. No single explanation fully accounts for every fragment. Her power was real enough to leave traces, but not preserved clearly enough to become a full political biography. That is one of the central tensions of ancient women's history. Visibility is not the same as speech. Her fourth revelation is about collapse. The fall of Amarna was not simply the abandonment of a city. It was the failure of a complete symbolic system. Akhenaten had been built to make Akhenaten's vision permanent. Its temples open to the sun. Its art reshaped the royal body. Its palaces staged a sacred family. Its boundaries declared divine choice. Meritaten grew up as one of the living proofs that this world had a future. And then, within a generation, the city lost its purpose. Older gods returned. Names changed. Buildings were dismantled. Later memory stepped around Akhenaten's line as if it could heal history by omission. Meritaten's disappearance is therefore not a side note. It is a human measure of the collapse. When the system fell, the people who embodied it became difficult to remember. This is why Meritaten's story remains so haunting. She's not famous like Nefertiti, whose bust has become an icon. She's not famous like Tutankhamun, whose tomb turned a short reign into a modern legend. She's not famous like Akhenaten, whose religious experiment still provokes argument. Meritaten is quieter. She stands between them, daughter of the revolutionary king and queen, possible wife of a shadowy successor, sister or half-sister within the tangled royal household that leads toward Tutankhamun's restoration. A woman named often enough to matter, but not enough to be understood. She's the kind of figure history usually loses completely. By chance, stone, and damage, she remains partly visible. And through that partial visibility, she widens the story of Amarna. Without Meritaten, Akhenaten's age can become too focused on one king's strange theology or one queen's famous beauty. With Meritaten, the period becomes a family drama, a dynastic puzzle, a study in female visibility, and a lesson in how power uses children, names, art, and ritual to claim eternity. Her fragments show the revolution at human scale. A city can be founded in the desert, but a daughter must grow up inside it. A god can be declared supreme, but a princess must carry that god in her name. A court can stage certainty, but a young woman must stand in the dangerous space where certainty fails. So Meritaten still reveals the fragile heart of Amarna. She shows that history is often preserved not by complete stories, but by damaged edges. A title here, a carved daughter there, a name beloved by a god later rejected, a possible queenship beside a king who barely remains. She does not give us closure. She gives us something more uneasy and perhaps more honest, the sense of a real life caught inside a brilliant system that could not last. In the end, Meritaten is not merely the lost daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. She is one of the clearest reminders that even in ancient Egypt, where kings carved stone to speak forever, memory could still break, and a person once placed beneath the brightest sun could become a shadow that only fragments of light reveal. And so the city grows quiet again. The sun still rises over the eastern cliffs, just as it did when Akhenaten named the place the horizon of the Aten, just as it did when Nefertiti stood in carved brilliance, just as it did when Meritaten's small figure was shaped beneath rays ending in tiny hands. The light has not changed, only the people have gone. The temples are broken, the palaces are dust. The painted floors that once turned desert rooms into gardens survive only in fragments. The royal road no longer carries chariots, and the voices of officials, servants, artists, priests, and princesses have thinned into silence. Meritaten remains there in a strange way, not as a ghost in the dramatic sense, but as a pattern left behind, a name, a title, a daughter's outline, a possible queen beside a nearly vanished king. She reminds us that history is not made only from the lives that were fully recorded. It is also made from the lives that almost disappeared, from people who stood close to enormous events and yet left only enough evidence to trouble the mind. She was born into a family that tried to make sunlight eternal. She grew inside a city built from belief. She became part of a sacred image that promised order, life, and continuity. Then the image cracked and the world moved on. There is something quietly human in that. Every age builds its certainties. Every court, kingdom, city, and household imagines that its arrangements will last longer than they do. The people of Amarna carved their truth into stone, but stone was reused. They placed names in cartouches, but names were erased. They built temples open to the sky, but the sky did not preserve them. What endured was not certainty, but fragments. And sometimes fragments are enough to keep a life from vanishing completely. Meritaten's story does not end with a final answer. It ends with a horizon, somewhere between royal daughter and royal woman, between Nefertiti's shadow and Smenkhkare's mystery, between the Aten's rise and Amun's return. She remains suspended. We cannot follow her all the way into the dark, but we can see where the light touched her, and perhaps that is the gentlest way to leave her not solved, not possessed, not forced into a certainty the evidence cannot bear, but standing once more in the pale gold of Amarna, a lost daughter beneath an ancient sun, still visible because history, even when broken, sometimes remembers just enough